Cool Figure TV. Revolutionary salute. Revolutionary salute. Like, share, subscribe. Welcome to the House of Revolution. You know I'm your humble host, the Yao Mean of Revolution. And the dragon humiliates the eagle and bring Trump to his knees. Before we get into that, be sure to wipe your feet. That means hit the like button. You in the House of Revolution. Like, share, subscribe, support the platform, y'all. Well, China has humiliated Trump. He's lost. Xi Jinping showed no mercy. Let's get into the content. Salute.
Hey everybody, Dr. G here. I'm a clinical and forensic psychologist as well as a body language expert. And today we're going to be analyzing the behavior and body language of President Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping during their meeting in South Korea. Before we get started, a couple of quick things. One, I wanted to make sure you know this is not a psychological evaluation of any kind. These are just my opinions. In addition to that, I do want to remind you to like and subscribe if you want to see more content just like this. All right, let's go. Today, we're going to start by analyzing their initial meeting. We're going to be looking at President Trump and President Xi when they first interact. All right, let's just jump right in.
Mr. President.
Now, the first thing you're noticing is the smile on his face. Now, this is just a polite smile, something that people do frequently, but you can see that him doing that as he sees President Xi walking towards him signals that he really is going to be trying to get along during this. We saw some similar behavior when he met with President Putin, but there are going to be some distinct differences as well. Let's just keep going.
With China. Well, it's going to finish the U.S. economy off.
Something else you probably noticed is that he extended his hand well before President Xi got there. That's meant to be a welcoming behavior. When we're unconsciously really trying hard to get along with somebody, we might do something like that. So what we're not seeing right there, at least not with him extending his hand in that way, we're not seeing a power play. It's showing an eagerness to get along, an eagerness to introduce.
He couldn't power play like he do everybody else.
See, doing that does not wait for him to get there. It can be a much stronger power play if somebody gets there and then you wait for them to reach out to shake your hand. So the fact that he's doing it first does imply that he really is trying to do something as far as getting along here. There's no overt power plays happening yet. Now, something else we're noticing here, because I've talked about this previously, I talked about this when he met with President Putin, is that sometimes he'll grab people by the hand and pull them towards him. He's done this with President Macron. He's done it in front of cameras. Cameras being there does not make him shy away from doing that. But we didn't see him do that here, which once again, I think he's got something he wants to accomplish, and he's going to be trying to accomplish that by being friendly, by not doing things that are overt power plays. You also see his hand on President Xi's back. He pats him on the back. It's meant to be friendly. Unconsciously, we're doing that to connect with somebody else. And he also has his head turned. He's trying to look him directly in the eye. So he's trying to connect with him in pretty much every way that's conceivable. So right now, what we're seeing is someone who is trying to connect, not someone who's trying to dominate.
He couldn't dominate. He had to be friendly.
You also saw that President Trump stepped forward a little bit. Once again, that's a way to feel closer to somebody. So for him, he is trying to build a relationship right now. He's leaning forward a little bit as well. So the goal of this, it's very different than when he met with President Putin. That was very warm. That was one where he was trying to be very friendly. He was more expressive. This is also meant to connect, but it's in a very different way. This doesn't seem like a friendship. This seems more like a business partnership or something like that. So his body language, while still attempting to connect, is not as warm as it was with President Putin.
Good to meet you. Great pleasure to see you again. Good to see you again.
Now, President Xi, this is pretty typical for him. He doesn't have a lot of strong facial expressions. He's less expressive than President Trump. So what we're seeing from President Xi right now is pretty much what we would expect.
Me too. And we're going to have a very successful meeting, I have no doubt.
Now, one thing you might notice, at least this is what it appears to be. It's a little bit hard to tell, but it appears that President Trump has a pretty strong grip right now. Now, he didn't pull President Xi towards him, but it could be that he's providing a very strong grip with his handshake. So there may be some minor power plays going on right here, but nothing too strong.
Okay. Good to see you again.
But you see how President Trump keeps looking at President Xi. That's an attempt to connect. When we want to be around somebody, when we want to connect with them, we try to meet them in the eyes or to look at their face. And he continues to try to do that. The challenge is that because they speak two different languages, they're going to miss each other a lot, but there is an attempt to connect.
Me too. And we're going to have a very successful meeting, I have no doubt. But he's a very tough negotiator. That's not good. We know each other.
One thing you're going to notice is that President Trump, this is pretty typical of him also, is to smile, to laugh. He likes to get along with people in that way. When that's not reflected back, it's hard to keep up that energy. And because President Xi just doesn't tend to be that way, he's not reflecting it back. I don't think that it's a sign of unfriendliness.
He could care less. People have already shown when Xi met Putin, smiles, hugs, friendly nature, they're brothers. He could care less what Trump's talking to Trump. It's good to meet you. She just, yeah, whatever. Let's get down to business. And the business is you're going to rescind all those tariffs you put on us, or you won't get no goddamn rare earth metals. You're going to take all those taxes off of us, or we ain't buying none of your soybeans. China humiliated this man. He being so friendly when he was just saying, I won't even go. I won't even meet Xi. Now you hear him kissing his ass before the goddamn world, and Xi could care less. How humiliating.
But President Trump abandons that very, very quickly. Watch this right here.
But he's a very tough negotiator. That's not good.
You see him looking down after that interaction right there. And to me, that says that he's realizing he's going to keep this strictly business. Some of the warmth and the friendliness is probably going to be less effective. So you're not going to see as much of that after this moment.
Why? Because it didn't work. She wasn't gonna give you no smiles, no brotherly hugs. You could try to flatter him. That's what Trump don't understand. All that New York finessing don't work with Putin, Xi Jinping, or Kim Jong Un, or the Iranians, or the Venezuelans. All that don't work. He's a very tough negotiator. Oh, this gonna be hard, man. Get the fuck out of here, bro. Our grocery prices going up. Could you just get down to business? Tell him you apologize and you'll never do it again.
That's not good. We know each other well.
No, y'all
This
don't.
expression here shows a
No,
little
y'all
bit of
don't.
discomfort.
You
You
don't
saw
look
President
like
Trump's blink rate pick up a little bit as well. There's a little bit of discomfort with that interaction.
Mr. President, do you plan to sign a trade deal today?
Could be.
Now you see his eyebrows go up when he said, do you plan to sign a trade deal today? He said, could be. That's something he feels very strongly. He really wants to emphasize that could actually happen. So
now we're going to get into exactly what happened. I just want to let the body language expert start this off, and then we'll let analysts break this meeting down. But to see the humiliation, Trump doing all that talking, why you talking so much? She ain't said nothing.
As he's talking about that, I think he actually means that. He does genuinely
Shake hands,
believe
let's go sit
that
down.
the trade deal could be signed.
Mr. President, do you plan to sign a trade deal today?
Could be.
See how high up his eyebrows went?
We'll have a great understanding. We have a great relationship. We've always had a great relationship.
Please certify U.S.
Yeah, or we can see how great the relationship is.
Will you discuss Taiwan?
Now, he was already initiating leaving, but after this question was asked, you see him put his hand on President Xi's back. And that's basically signaling, I am going to be in control of this and move this along. I'm going to go ahead and exit this situation. So this is very, very similar to how he handled, once again, how he handled the situation with President Putin.
Which way?
He want to be in control. He's not.
Thank you very much.
Now we're going to look at a little bit of this from a different angle because it shows us a little bit more.
Mr. President, the President of the People's Republic of China.
Now, I want you to pay attention to President Trump's feet. So right now, he's standing with his feet pointing directly forward, as one would if they're standing this way.
Mr. President, the President of the People's Republic of China.
So as President Xi walks up, you can see his foot points directly at him. Now, you might go, well, obviously it does. He's facing him to talk to him. But that's not always the case. The way that we direct our feet, the way we point our feet, oftentimes suggests how we feel about something. You could be talking to somebody and your feet may be pointing towards the exit because you want to get out of there. You'd be surprised at how much of a difference the direction our feet actually makes. Let's watch this again and see where it goes.
Mr. President, the President of the People's Republic of China.
So as you can see, President's left foot is pointing more directly at President Xi, whereas President Xi's feet are pointing
See, you hear Trump press lady, the People's Republic of China. You never say that. Why y'all always call them the communist, the Chinese Communist Party? That's what y'all call them. Well, they ain't. They is right there in your face. They communists, but keep disrespecting them like you always do. Nasty. Now, the president of China. Y'all been talking the man was a dictator every day. Now your president when he in your face. That's what people picking up on. You talk all that shit about the Chinese when they're not around. When China's in your face, you're so friendly. Now he's the president. Now they're People's Republic of China and not the Communist Party that y'all keep talking about. The world is taking notice.
Directly forward. Now, the difference here suggests that President Trump wants to make this a little bit more friendly, whereas President Xi is seeing this more as purely business. He probably doesn't have that same desire to make things a little bit more personal, because President Trump just has a tendency to do that with world leaders.
You steady saying they're your enemy. You steady saying they're your enemy, and then when they're in your face, this is my good buddy. We so friendly. Nobody respect that. You're calling them your enemy all on TV, drooling at the mouth. Now you're begging them to pull your ass out of financial collapse. The farmers, you talk shit. That's why I'm standing for them. Quit talking shit about China and then begging them to do business with you. That's what's so crazy. But see, we understand them talking shit about you, then begging to get your dollars. But white America needs to understand that China is tired of that shit. Quit going on social media talking shit about China, then begging them to buy all of your bullshit.
President, do you plan to sign a trade deal today?
That's when they know they got you by the throat.
I think we'll have a great understanding. We have a great relationship. We've always had a great relationship.
So after President Trump talked about this trade deal, you could hear it getting translated, and then you see President Xi's chin go up. Now, this is probably the most pronounced body language that President Xi has had during all of this. And what it suggests is that there is a sense of pride about this, that there is a sense of strength and confidence. So the automatic chin going up suggests that he has no interest in being submissive about anything regarding a trade deal. So we saw probably the strongest body language coming from Xi after that statement.
I think we'll have a great understanding. We have a great relationship. We've always had a great relationship.
Now we're very briefly going to look at President Trump and President Xi towards the end of this trade deal negotiation.
And it feels very warm seeing you again, because it's been many years since your re-election. We have spoken on the phone.
So as you can see, as President Xi is speaking, President Trump is nodding. And a big part of that is that he shows a lot of body language. President Trump just expresses however he's feeling. So it's very different when you see President Xi hearing something translated, because he has very little to no reaction, whereas President Trump reacts to most everything.
Phone 3 times, exchanged several letters, and stayed in close contact. And our joint guidance, China-US relations.
Now, it's also interesting that we see President Trump pull his hands out and cross his fingers like this. Watch what I'm talking about right here.
Contact.
This is how President Trump oftentimes sits at the White House. You see him take this position a lot. And for him, this is a position of power. So as they're speaking right now, this isn't him trying to gain power in that situation, but he's trying to appear powerful.
He's not.
And our joint guidance, China-US relations have remained stable on the whole. Given our different national conditions, we do not always see eye to eye with each other.
Now, that's interesting. One thing he did show, watch President Xi's hands right here.
National conditions, we do not always see eye to eye with each other.
So when he's saying we don't always see eye to eye with each other, that is something he actually likely feels, because you saw his hands open up right there.
And it is normal for the 2 leading economies of the world.
And now President Trump is doing the steepling, which you've probably heard me talk about if you've ever seen one of my videos, which is a way to appear to be an expert. That's him trying to show a power sign right now. So that is an attempt to maintain a sense of power and authority.
World to have frictions now and
He
then.
had no power, no authority in the room with Xi Jinping. And everybody knew that.
And in the face of winds, waves, and challenges, you and I, at the helm of China-US relations, should stay the right course and ensure the steady sailing forward of the giant ship of China-US relations.
Now, he withdrew the steepling because I think in some sense he may have felt it was too strong. And this is all unconscious, but he may have felt like that body language was too much for the moment. So he withdrew his hands and put them below the table.
I always believe that China's development goes hand in hand with your vision to make America great again.
Distinguished and respected President of China, and we will be having some discussions. I think we've already agreed to a lot of things, and we'll agree to some more right now. But President Xi is a great leader, a great country.
President Xi. I thought he was an evil dictator, the Communist Party, the Red Army. who's trying to sabotage America. See, this is the humiliation I'm talking about. Whatever you say behind somebody's back, say it to their face. Marco Rubio, you be Drew, the Communist People's Party of China, who's sabotaging America and stealing all our stuff, our number one adversary. There they go right there. Your number one adversary is across. Y'all so polite when they're in the room. You're so humble. You're so understanding. You're so sincere. The world is watching. And what the Europeans want to know is, how the hell did you come out of meeting with China and they paying less than the Europeans paying? How is it that the Europeans got higher tariffs on them, your good buddies in Europe, than the Chinese do? The whole world know you got pumped.
And I think we're going to have a fantastic relationship for a long period of time.
All right, we'll go ahead and wrap things up here. Hopefully this is helping you better understand some of the behavior and body language that we saw. It was very...
All right, so I just wanted y'all to get some of the body language stuff. That we can get into some analysts, break this stuff down like we always do. But I want to get that out the way first and foremost, so we can know that the humiliation is serious. Now, let's hit this real quick. Let's throw this in.
Of all of the problems of the world.
And in the face of winds, waves, and challenges, you and I, at the helm of China-US relations, should stay the right course and ensure the steady sailing forward of the giant ship of China-US relations.
But overall, I guess on the scale of from 0 to 10, with 10 being the best, I would say the meeting was a 12.
For all the hype of a breakthrough surrounding the meeting between President Xi and President Trump, it was closer to a truce than an outright or even a durable peace. President Trump was posting characteristically bullish going into the meeting, with the last post just minutes before meeting President Xi, saying that the G2 will be convening shortly.
A truce means the U.S. lose. It's the U.S. started the trade war. China didn't start this. China said, no, let's just make money. We don't want this. The U.S. started. No, you're ripping us off. You're making too much. You're ripping the U.S. off. You're stealing our stuff. You're spying on us. You're going to pay more than the whole world. 150% tariffs. The U.S. started that shit. You won't be getting none of our advanced technology on chips. The U.S. started that shit. We're taxing every ship made in China. The U.S. started that shit. Now they had to roll all of that stuff back and say, hey, let's be friends and let's make money. That's called losing and humiliation.
He opened the meeting with Xi, describing him as a great friend of mine and a distinguished and respected president. And he left the meeting saying that on a scale of 1 to 10, the meeting with Xi was 12. Trump and Xi standing together projected a return to what some analysts are calling competitive coexistence. And that G2 comment by Trump revives a term that symbolizes a shared global leadership, which was coined in 2005 by the US economist Fred Bergsten to describe a world that was going to be led jointly by Washington and Beijing. Now, that description has always been pushed back by China, by the way, most explicitly in 2009 by then Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao, saying that it did not align with China's peaceful diplomatic principles. They've always said that they do not believe in an exclusivity of leadership of the world, preferring multilateralism. President Trump and Chinese leader Xi Jinping met face-to-face for the first time in 6 years in South Korea to resolve those recent tensions that started from Trump's trade war against China in April, when he threatened tariffs as high as 145%. And the Chinese posted videos of Chairman Mao saying that they will never bow to blackmail, and they vowed to fight to the end. The two leaders last met in person in 2019 when they held an 80-minute lunch on the sidelines of a group of 20 meeting in Osaka, Japan. Now, at that time as well, it was to resolve trade issues. Now, apart from the measures that they've agreed so far, more importantly, the two leaders will be meeting again, with President Trump to go to China in April next year, followed by a reciprocal visit from President Xi later that year. Now, this will help to set out a broader, long-term diplomatic relationship between the two, as well as the two countries. And this contrasts sharply with his first-term approach, when his engagement with Xi was often ad hoc and almost always overshadowed by escalating tariff battles. Going into the meeting, China hawks in the United States had been screeching that President Trump was about to totally capitulate and give up the strategic gains that the US had gained over the past decade. So they're not going to be happy with the outcome this time round, and they will no doubt be planning how to take it off track. The first Trump presidency put the United States and China on a pathway towards long-term, unquestionable competition. It was a full-on Graham Allison's Thucydides dynamic of the competition between a rising power versus the established power. Between 2018 and 20, Trump initiated a trade war, which was a textbook response with tariffs, tech bans, and economic decoupling measures, which was aimed to halt or slow China, the rising power's ascent. Now, a simple strategy was then to reassert US primacy through confrontation. Trump 2.0 versions happened because China signaled that that earlier model was no longer going to work. As the Wall Street Journal and others have been writing, President Xi adopted a new playbook on dealing with President Trump. When Trump punched, they basically punched back even harder. It made the US realize that open confrontation was too costly and that critical US interests, from managing China's chokehold on rare earth minerals to staunching the flow of fentanyl, requires a transactional dialogue. You wouldn't think that they needed to be told this. Talking always helps. Now, this detente pivots Trump back to his preferred role as that central deal maker. He prefers securing economic relief, like resuming the soybean purchases, that plays well with Republican rural voting states. What's also an important factor that will support Trump is that increasingly a majority of Americans favor a policy of cooperation and engagement with China, and they oppose higher tariffs on it as well, according to surveys done. This is a subtle but significant shift. Public sentiment has moved faster than Washington's own rhetoric. For the first time since 2017, more Americans favor engagement over containment, and that suggests that Trump's own pragmatic reset will actually play well with the voters. The recent survey done by the Chicago Council of Global Affairs found that 53% of Americans said that the United States should undertake friendly cooperation and engagement with Beijing rather than actively work to limit its global influence. This is up from 40% last year. The majority of Americans, 54% of them, also oppose higher tariffs on Chinese goods, according to the poll. After today's meeting in South Korea, both countries reached a strategic stalemate in which we can expect them to continue to de-risk from each other. China is going to keep pushing for more self-sufficiency in the chip sector, and the US is going to continue on that marathon to build those alternative rare earth supply chains. The deal itself appears to be a transactional truce for 1 year at least, but it is a win-win for both sides and for those watching across the world from the sidelines, or in the case of the Netherlands, that was brought into that US soup, having expropriated Nexperia. Where we stand currently is that it gives both countries more time to work on their weaknesses that were exposed during the past 6 months, more on the US side than the Chinese side, to be honest. Especially when we think about the fact that the US expected that the Chinese were going to be hit hard economically by the whole of the US economics team. In fact, their exports rose. I discussed this in my last vlog, how in April, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent thought that the China's tariffs against the United States were a losing hand for them because the US imports much more from them than it exports. Even the White House press secretary, Carolyn Levitt, at the time, reflected that hubris at the White House, saying that China needs to make a deal with us. We don't have to make a deal with them. China wants what we have, the American consumer. The latest 100% tariffs threat by Trump that was due to go into play on November the 1st has officially been taken off the table, and that was expected by everyone, including the market, so there's no surprise there. Trump also gave China an immediate sweetener of a reduction of 10% from those fentanyl tariffs. Chinese tariffs now stand at 47% versus those earlier 57%. Trump said that Xi was going to work very hard to stop the flow of precursor chemicals that the United States had been saying that were used to make that a highly addictive and dangerous drug that was sweeping across the United States, creating many, many deaths. He said that, "I think you'll see some real action taken." The US had put a 20% tariff on Chinese products specifically to put pressure on Beijing over the fentanyl. Now, the Chinese have agreed to delay the rare earth controls that they imposed on October the 9th, where any global product containing more than 0.1% of a China-sourced rare earth needed export approval from Beijing. The October orders were, in the words of US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent at the time, a bazooka at the supply chains and the industrial base of the entire free world. However, China's not backed away from those stringent export control rules that it imposed on critical minerals in April this year and last December as well. The April rules halted exports from China of 7 kinds of rare earth materials and rare earth magnets, and licenses had to be issued by the ministry for you to get one. The December rules imposed similar requirements on 2 metallic elements which were vital for making certain semiconductors and 2 other elements which were needed for military ammunition. Now, the April rules were what created that chaos across car makers in the world, where they suddenly had to stop production. Right now, it seems those rules stay. It's not clear that China's agreement with the United States would apply to Europe as well, but European leaders are also meeting China tomorrow, I think. So it is likely that they will be extended to them as well. In return, the United States has suspended its BIS 50% rule that was introduced out of nowhere by the Secretary of Commerce, Howard Lutnick. This extended Washington's blacklist of firms that were prohibited from doing business with US companies and individuals to their subsidiaries as well. And it was because of this that the number of Chinese companies that were hit jumped from being 3,000 previously to over 20,000. This is what created the uproar in China that the US was acting in bad faith in the midst of the trade talks between the 2 countries. It will be interesting to see how the Netherlands takes this news, and will it now back down off its expropriation that it had done of Nexperia. It may be pressurized to do so by other European countries so that they can also get a rollback on their rare earth controls that China had imposed on them also. Going forward, the extended BIS rule to 50% subsidiary ownership may stay off the agenda for a while now, as rare earth supply chains take several years, if not decades, to set up. So the US won't be igniting that particular war soon. In fact, it will need to do more so that China removes some of those earlier controls it imposed this year. China is the undisputed leader of that critical mineral supply chain, and it produces roughly 70% of the world's supply of rare earths, and it processes around 90% of those. Doesn't matter how many deals that the United States makes with Australia or Japan, China's dominance isn't going very soon. Earlier, Trump leaving aboard Air Force One when he left South Korea, at that time he had said that China's decision to delay these rare earth export restrictions should be extended routinely. China hawks in the US are not happy with this delay on the BIS rule because they see it as giving more Chinese companies now access to advanced technology that they would rather not give. In leveraging its dominance over rare earth minerals, China was more or less mirroring the American restrictions on exports of high-end chip technologies, which are similarly vital to its own development of a modern economy. Those US restrictions impeded China's ambition in artificial intelligence and keeping top Chinese AI companies a step behind, or a nanosecond behind, as Jensen Huang put it. However, President Xi gave Trump an easy win, or a sell, to his MAGA supporters on the soybeans. Coming up to the meeting, China, as a goodwill measure, had already resumed small purchases of those US soybeans, around 180,000 metric tons, for this coming December to January shipment. Scott Bessent has confirmed that it was agreed that the Chinese now will be buying 12 million metric tons of soybeans during this season, which is between now and January. And then for the next 3 years, they're going to be buying a minimum of 25 million metric tons per annum. This will then take Chinese buying of soybeans from the United States back to its 2023 numbers, when the US shipped nearly 25 million metric tons to China, according to the American Soybean Association. China's been amongst the top buyers of US soybeans, accounting for around 45% of its exports for several years now. Both countries put on hold for 1 year those higher port fees, which the US placed on Chinese-linked vessels as part of its broader push to curb China's dominance in global shipbuilding. And it prompted similar duties from Beijing as well. In 2024, Chinese shipyards completed around 53% of the global commercial shipbuilding. Now, this compares to around 28% for South Korea and 12% for Japan. US shipyards accounted for less than 1% of global output. President Donald Trump has signed an executive order earlier in April, which he vowed to revitalize the American shipbuilding. And he just signed that deal with South Korea for them to spend $150 billion to help the United States to rebuild that industry. China buying US chips from NVIDIA came up in the discussion. But when Trump was asked if he's going to allow NVIDIA's new Blackwell AI chip to be sold to China, he said, well, we're not talking about the Blackwell yet. But a lot of chips, a lot of chips, and that's good for us. The Blackwell B30A chip is a new product by NVIDIA to replace the H20, which China no longer wants. But it's still being deliberately throttled back chip, which has been designed for the Chinese market so that it won't trigger US restrictions, but it is more powerful than the H20. NVIDIA stock, which hit that 5 trillion mark on Wednesday, more than the GDP of Germany. Investors had been hoping that the meeting between President Trump and Xi would ease NVIDIA's access to China. Well, they didn't get that, and it was off 2% on Thursday morning. Giving high-tech chips to the Chinese is a very difficult call for the United States president, even Donald Trump, given that bipartisanship that exists between the China hawks in D.C. And despite any arguments that Jensen Huang may have made about the importance of seeking NVIDIA chips to ensure that the adoption of the American stack ecosystem occurred in the world, including China. But he does have Trump's ear, so you never know. Maybe something will pop up in the days and weeks ahead when there's less focus on the US-China relationship. Trump and Xi are also expected to sign off on the details of a deal to allow TikTok to continue to operate in the US. According to Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, he had earlier promised that the two leaders would consummate that transaction at the meeting. No details have still been released on any proposed structure. Now, regardless of all the negativity in the press about this relationship, I do believe anytime leaders spend time together, there is a greater opportunity to understand each other as well as each other's nations. That can only help to make better decisions for the long run. I'm Nijma Minhas with GVS Deep Dive. Share with me your thoughts on
(2025). And while President Trump may be raving about his recent in-person meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping, countless questions still remain about what those talks and that continued truce means for the ongoing tensions between the US and China. It means for all of the businesses who have been impacted by Trump's chaotic set of announcements this year, from 100% tariffs and beyond. Can these businesses trust anything that Trump says on any given day when it's bound to change a week or two later? And are we likely to see more continued tensions between the US and China as you still have those hawks in Washington that are desperate for a war with Beijing, even though they know that even the US military is not going to be able to decouple from the country that it wants to fight so badly? We got into all of that and more with a special guest earlier, so let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is Carl Zha, a geopolitical analyst and host of the Silk and Steel podcast. Carl, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, it's great to have you on the show. Now, I want to get your take on the latest here, as I know that the presidents of the US and China met in person for the first time in 6 years, and they basically agreed to extend their current truce. You've got China agreeing to postpone restrictions on exports of crucial rare earth minerals for a year, while the US agreed to stay its tariffs of 100% on Chinese goods and its threat of export controls on subsidiaries of blacklisted Chinese firms. Trump is describing this meeting as amazing, a 12 out of 10. It seems as though he went to a different meeting than the one he actually went to. But how do you see these talks, and how likely is this truce to lead to an actual deal?
You know, Rachel, I always enjoy taco, especially Taco Thursday. But I mean, Trump will present anything as a big victory. That's what he does because he's a reality TV show host, and he's a salesman essentially. What happened was the last time when we talked was when U.S. and China had a meeting that agreed to have a ceasefire in the trade war. So what happened in September was United States broke that ceasefire. In September 29th, they came out with expanded list of blacklisted Chinese semiconductor companies to include any foreign firms that's at least 50% owned by a Chinese company as well. And that led to the Dutch government to seize a Chinese company, Nesperia, a semiconductor company that's owned by its Chinese parent company, Wintec, away from China, under a very dubious wartime provision. And so that's what happened when the trade war escalated. China expanded the export control on rare earth exports, and that led Scott Bessent going ballistic. Now, at the end of the day, China has shown its hold all the cards. You know, China stopped purchasing soybean, which really hurted a lot of the Trump-based voters, and China, there's really no going around the rare earth export control because in today's world, rare earth goes into everything. And as I mentioned before, China digs about 61% of the rare earth. But most importantly, China controls 90% of the rare earth refining. So the Mountain Pass mine in California, which do produce rare earth, up to April this year, they were still sending rare earths to China for processing because there's no processing refining capability in the United States. And they only stopped it in April because of Trump's Liberation Day announcement that raised the tariff sky high. So what Trump did is that he tried to, he signed a whole bunch of rare earths supply agreement with countries like Cambodia, Thailand, Malaysia, Australia, Congo, etc., to show that, okay, we're doing something about this issue. But again, that does not address the core issue. That might get you some rare earth, but you still need to refine them. And right now, you still need to rely on the Chinese factories to refine those rare earth. Then you run into the rare earth export control problem again. So this is basically Trump has caved yet again, as we all expected, but he's going to spawn this off as a great victory. In the meantime, China is very strained in the response. You know, they're giving Trump just enough so he can present it as a victory, like resuming the soybean purchase. So which we just basically take us back to the days before April. Right? Then why did you go through all these crazy tariff announcements ending up in the same place? And also, Trump have cut down the so-called fentanyl tax from fentanyl tariff from 20% to 10% on China's, saying China promised to cooperate with U.S. on the fentanyl issue. But China has always said they want to cooperate with the United States on the fentanyl issue. So again, nothing is new here. So now the net result is that the total tariff on Chinese goods today is actually lower on some of the so-called U.S. ally countries. So that means all the businesses who were forced to shift their supply chain out of China back in April after Trump's liberation announcement just found themselves lost all that money, effort, and time because they were forced to move production out because they thought, okay, the tariff on China was going to go sky high. But now the tariff on China is lower than some of the other countries, and this is again, it sucks for business. But Trump is going to present that again as a great victory, and I think some of his base will go follow along on that line anyway. So this is why I said, we can't always count on whether Taco Tuesday or Taco Thursday, because Trump will always think as a victory, and some of his core base will always believe that no matter what. So Trump always have room to back down and doing tacos again.
Yeah, exactly. It's like Trump literally started this fight to then claim that he won the fight, and China's just over here like, oh, okay, well, yeah, sure, we'll buy more soybeans if that's what you really want, right? Acting as though, yeah, okay, Trump. And I thought it was actually interesting that the New York Times kind of admitted this. They had a story earlier today with the headline, "The Art of Letting Trump Claim a Win While Walking Away Stronger," where they note that by withholding soybean purchases and rare earth exports, China extracted relief from U.S. tariffs and delayed export controls without conceding much in return. And they also said that Mr. Xi's message seemed to be Beijing had proven its capacity to hit back, and Washington would do well to remember it. And when it comes to the position that China is in, kind of dealing with Trump's craziness, the U.S. establishment's craziness, how do you view kind of where China stands now after all of this mess that has been the last year?
After all these Trump fiasco, China has shown itself to be a true global leader. China is one of the few countries that stood up to U.S. Tariff game and said, no, we're not going to play that game. If you're going to hit us with tariff, we'll hit you back. We are peers. We're equals. We will not be bullied, and we don't want to escalate into a trade war, but if you're gonna force this on us, we're gonna fight back. And I think that won China a lot of credit all over the world. And on one hand, people see that China delivers on what they promise, and Trump will revise his mind in a tweet after 48 hours. There's not much credibility anymore in U.S. government. Why would you believe whatever Trump says? And even, like I said, in case of those businesses that have to shift their supply chain outside of China because of Trump policy, now finding themselves losing tons of money because of the Trump policy, how would they now trust anything that the administration says anymore? That this is not good for the United States. This is also reflected in the global public opinion. The U.S. standing in the global public opinion poll has fallen drastically in the span of last year. From 2024 to 2025.
Yeah, it's very telling. And you look at Trump and you go, okay, what are you doing here? I guess you win some headlines. A lot of the headlines I'm seeing are actually kind of like the New York Times was saying, right? Kind of calling Trump out on this one, that sure, you want to make it sound like you got to win, but at the end of the day, we all know what really happened. Now, as that's happening, I also want to bring up some of Trump's other comments, because he declared this week that because of other countries' testing programs, I have instructed the Department of War to start testing our nuclear weapons on an equal basis. Now, I know this comes as Russia unveiled the successful test launch of the Burevestnik, an unlimited range nuclear powered missile, and as the last remaining nuclear treaty between the US and Russia is set to expire in just 3 months. But do you see Trump's statement as also a warning to China? And should we be worried about an increasing nuclear arms race between the US, Russia, and China?
Well, the problem with Trump being a reality TV show host is that he treats everything as optics, just optics. Like when he sees that, Russia is showing advancement in their upgrading their nuclear program, he needs to have something to show. It's like, I got to show my mushroom is bigger than yours. And it's very immature. And this actually does not advance Washington's interest, because China, Russia, and United States, they have all halted live nuclear testings since 1990s. And United States and Russia, because they have conducted a lot of tests beforehand, they already have a lot of data. So people that could benefit from live testing of weapons are new entrants into the nuclear arm race. So, countries like North Korea and possibly Iran, if Iran goes to the nuclear route, they would need the data to perfect their new nuclear arsenal. Now, China, which hasn't been testing nuclear weapons, if U.S. does kick off live testing on nuclear weapon again, China for sure will also do live testing of their own nuclear arsenal. And because China conducted much less nuclear tests previously than U.S. or Russia, so if the live nuclear testing to resume, China actually stand to benefit more because they will be able to conduct more tests and collect more data to perfect their weapon program even more. So this does not advance U.S. interest in a competition versus China. But this is Trump. For Trump, it's all about optics. And that's why he kind of backtracks. Like now he's saying, oh, maybe it's not nuclear nukes I'm talking about. It's about like nuclear. We're talking about doing nuclear missile tests, because for him it's more important to demonstrate capability, right? And the thing is, it's not a secret about U.S. nuclear capability. Many people know U.S. have the second highest number of nukes, and U.S. has a lot of missiles. But for Trump, that's not enough. I got to show it off to the public, to the whole world to see. So again, this is just a Trump thing, and we'll have to see what come out of it. But if he does kick off live nuclear testing, that's only going to benefit China, Iran, North Korea, etc.
Yeah, and it's interesting because as you're describing it there, I'm sitting there going, okay, so the U.S. has all of these enemies around the world, right? All of these countries it doesn't like, places it wants to see regime change. All of those countries are friends. So if you have Russia in a position where, as right now, we're seeing them introducing all of this new technology, being like, oh, we made this, we made that. Well, they're also friends with China. So if we get into a position where the U.S. starts building up, whether it's testing, whether it's some new announcement about a weapon, I feel like Russia and China are looking at each other going, hey, let's work together. What does that mean for the overall arms race here? And do you think that the U.S. realizes that? Because they seem to act like Washington is still the top dog. Nothing that any of the other countries do can compare, but there is strength in numbers, especially when you're talking about countries like Russia and China.
Yeah, one of the problem is the top Washington elite. They're permanently stuck at the first two phases of the 5-stage grieving cycle, right? They keep on going from denial to anger, back to denial, back to anger again. But I think we're finally seeing some signs of very small movement toward bargaining phase. You're seeing that article, which you sent it to me from Atlantic, talking about U.S. is on the way to lose a war with China, right? Because the power balance has totally shifted. China is today a manufacturing superpower. Whereas when U.S. war planners, when they think about fighting a war against China, they're still thinking about fighting the last war. They think, oh, okay, we fought the Pacific War against the Empire of Japan. We know how this is done. We can do island hops, all that. But what they don't realize is the fundamental manufacturing strength has changed. If you were to do the Pacific War analogy, today's China is actually in the position of United States in 1941. And today's United States would be in the position of Empire of Japan in 1941 in terms of the industrial strength. And I think finally that's very slowly it's starting to trickle down to some of the Washington elite and talking heads to realize, war with China is not tenable. That's the way that we think it's going to go. That's not. it's at the current rate of projection, it's just that does not look good for the United States.
Yeah, it really doesn't. And mentioning that Atlantic article, I thought it was interesting because they're laying it out there, right? The US is on track to lose a war with China, and they point out the fact that modern warfare is decided by production capacity and technological mastery, not by individual valor. And I know that they're kind of saying that as a shot at Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, because he's acting like, oh, you just have to be brave and tough and manly, and you'll win whatever war you get into. But it's like, yeah, that is not going to win you a war against China when it comes to their technology, their production capacity. And you continue to see the US in this position where they, are still fighting a proxy war against Russia. They still are, arming Israel, whether it's so that they can bomb Gaza or for a future conflict with Iran. And they still want to take on China. And I think it goes back to what you were mentioning about those, the hawks in Washington, where it's like they still think that they are the top dog. They still are living in this delusional world. Do you see any sense that reality is creeping in? I mean, even just with these talks between Trump and Xi, where we're looking at it and going, okay, Trump is getting us to right back to where we were in March of this year. Is that likely to bring any reality into their world?
Well, I think there already some mind has been shifted on this. This is why we saw that leak from Pentagon talking about, we shouldn't make a top priority to contain China. Rather, we should focus on quote unquote homeland security and focus on the West Hemisphere, by which they mean sending ships to go intimidate Venezuela, right? So US can still remain the regional hegemon in the Western Hemisphere. I think there's some recognition now that it's at this present stage, the multipolarity is already a matter of fact, and it's going to be increasingly difficult for US to act like the unipolar superpower to dictate terms are all around the world. Even though, I mean, it's the old habits die hard. I mean, this is why, even though Trump says he wants to end the war in Ukraine, he still tried to dictate terms of peace to Russia. This is why, he was playing the hardball tactics of trying to put additional sanction on Russian oil purchase, and expect China and India to follow, Washington's diktat. But it's not working. It's not working, and they try to use economic coercion. Well, that didn't work either. Just as we show with the whole trade war with China, because at the end of the day, China hold more cards. Which actually makes if you think about it, makes the outright kinetic war with China even more ridiculous, when U.S. military depends on supplies coming from China. Even Raytheon CEO said we can't decouple from China. We still need to source parts from China. How are you gonna fight at China when you need Chinese to make components for you, and not to mention 80% of antibiotics in the United States still supplied by China. So all these talks about going war with China is just crazy talk. And finally, there's a shift of people talking. Okay, maybe let's just focus on what we could do. But because there has to be a war to be fought, so now they're shifting their attention to countries like Venezuela, South America, which it's not good for those countries, but at least they're getting a little bit more realistic with their capability.
Yeah, it has been interesting to kind of see the dreams of, right, because it goes back to Obama's pivot to Asia, right? This is not just a Trump plan or a Biden plan or anything else like that. There has been this long-term strategy to get all of these smaller countries and islands to work for the US, to be little proxies for a future conflict against China. And then you sit back and you go, wait a second, how exactly is that going to play out? The last thing I want to bring up is just China's handling of it. And this also kind of goes into Russia's handling of the US right now, because you have leaders that are like, hey, you want to get together in person and talk? We'll talk, right? You want to have dialogue, we're happy to do that. But how do you see the way that they are kind of handling the US while at the same time handling this growing multipolar world and trying to figure out, especially in China's case, if they're looking at being in the position that the US was in 1941 in terms of industrial production? It's like, okay, how do we do it right this time, right? How do we not become the crazy big empire? And I don't think that China is going to, but that has to be something that is kept in mind, especially as they are the country that is now seeing this massive growth.
Well, first of all, right now, leaders of China and Russia, Xi Jinping and Putin, they appear as real statesmen right now compared to Trump. And they have their own priority laid out, which for Putin, that is still, resolve the issue of Ukraine, because that issue is existential for Russia. For China, its top priority is still growing its own economy, preserving regional stability while it does so, because the last thing China wants is instability around its border areas, and because that the war is bad for business. So those are going to be, for foreseeable future, continue to be the top priority for those countries. Now, for how they deal with U.S., I mean, they dealt it like a responsible adult dealing with a petulant child, with a lot of patience, strategic restraint. And this is a thing that, because of American political culture, maybe they fail to understand, because China did not escalate as much when Trump first slapped sanction against China back in his first term, back in 2018. So from U.S. perspective, they think that's a sign of weakness. But what really happened is because China didn't want to escalate the trade war. They wanted to, just make it go away. But U.S. took that as a sign of weakness. Oh, China will not retaliate. We can just keep on cranking up our sanction pressure on them. So China, for the last 7 years, they had the time to prepare for the eventuality. They don't want to, but if there's a eventuality that they have to decouple with United States, they were preparing for that. So this is why this time they came with full deck of cards, because they were prepared. Whereas Trump, for some reason, they thought, after the Liberation Day announcement, after his tariff announcement, everything would just magically fall into place. And there's zero preparation. I mean, they completely taken by surprise when China retaliated via stopping purchasing soybeans or putting the export control on the rare earth exports. So this led to Trump serving Taco Tuesday, Taco Thursday again and again. And so that's unlikely to change until there's a mentality shift in Washington to treat other countries as equals. Like that might take some time because, like I said, the old habits die hard. China has shown that that's how they like to be dealt with, as equals. They can't be pushed around anymore. Another thing about how China will deal with this is, Dutch is going to be slapped around this time, because Dutch government was the one who first, on behalf of Washington, to seize a Chinese semiconductor company, Nesperia, from its Chinese parent company. And now that Trump has totally rolled back that policy, because the reason Dutch seized Nesperia is because Washington went to the Dutch government and said, hey, we know Nesperia is owned by a Chinese parent company, so if you don't do anything, we're gonna put it on an entity list. And Dutch says, oh no, okay, we'll take it away from the Chinese. But as a result of this current trade talk, Trump just suspended their new rule on this on the expanded entity list against Chinese semiconductor company. So Dutch government is going to look very foolish right now, acting as a loyal vassal of the United States, and there's already a lot of consequences. What the Dutch government sees was a headquarter of Nesperia, but Nesperia's manufacturing arm, which actually makes those semiconductors, is still in China. And so the Chinese government told them, look, your headquarters was seized illegally. You don't have to listen to them anymore. Now you will focus on supply semiconductors to Chinese companies domestically. Don't need to worry about this contract that your headquarters have signed to supply semiconductors to Europeans or Japanese or Americans. And this has led to a huge semiconductor shortage. You have a GM coming out saying they're weeks from running out of semiconductors. And the same thing with the German automakers. Honda shut down their Mexican plant because they're running out of semiconductors. And this is all because, well, ultimately it was because of Trump's policy, but specifically because the Dutch government decided to do this thing for Trump. And now they're going to be the one that's going to be hang out to dry, because people are now asking the question, okay, now why did you do this? Now the whole rationale for you doing this just evaporated. US just rolled back the rule. And I think Chinese government will very likely to make an example of the Dutch.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I think a great reminder that the Trump administration, they still are acting like they are the top dog. You still have countries that are going to try to comply, but as you're pointing out there, that compliance may only be good for a few weeks or a few months before Trump changes his mind. And then you have to bring in the question of, okay, what is actually good for business versus just what is trying to make Trump happy, because clearly that changes with the wind. I know that there is certainly a lot at stake here all around, and I always appreciate you taking the time to join me to break down all of the latest here and to educate us on a few things that are happening.
Donald Trump is losing the trade war against China, which he himself started. Trump held an important meeting with China's president, Xi Jinping, in South Korea on the 30th of October, and they came to a new agreement which essentially amounted to a one-year truce in the U.S. trade war. Now, in a few minutes here, I will look at the exact details of this agreement, and I will further discuss issues like Trump's tariffs on China and China's export restrictions on rare earths. I will also look at the trade between US and China, especially agricultural trade and China's exports of advanced technologies. And I will look at how China has been catching up in some cutting-edge high-tech sectors, especially semiconductors. But the main takeaway from all of this is that although this is not the end of the trade war, it's only a one-year truce, Donald Trump has clearly lost this battle in the trade war. China has won this battle. As the Financial Times put it, China is emerging as a U.S. peer rival at the Xi Jinping-Donald Trump summit. The FT noted that when Trump first started the trade war on China back in his first term as U.S. president, it actually surprised Beijing. However, the FT noted, quote, "This time, a better prepared and economically more powerful China has been able to fight its once far mightier opponent to a standstill," end quote. The FT noted that there were at least 3 examples of how China was able to defend itself and fight back in this trade war that Donald Trump started. First of all, Trump increased tariffs on China to 145% as an act of shock and awe. This was a kind of nuclear trade war, and Trump thought that China would give in and surrender. On the contrary, China defended itself and hit back with the exact same level of reciprocal tariffs, which freaked out the United States, and it backed down. Then the second example of China fighting back was when China put export controls on rare earths. And later I will show how China dominates the global production and processing of rare earth elements. that also freaked out the US because US industry relies very heavily on Chinese rare earths, and Trump once again was forced to back down. And then the US government extended export controls not only on semiconductors, but also to thousands of subsidiaries of Chinese companies. And in response to this, China tightened its controls on rare earths, which once again forced the US to back down. Unlike any other country on earth, Trump has been waging war on dozens of countries. China is the only one that was able to actually fight back and defend itself against the US and prevent Trump from imposing an unequal treaty. And this is why an analyst at the major European bank BNP Paribas wrote the following: the United States is accepting that, quote, it is now dealing with a peer rival capable of imposing material economic harm on it, a relatively new position for the US, and a development which, at least to us, confirms China's ascendancy to global economic superpower status, end quote. That is the money quote today. China is officially an economic superpower, and the US empire cannot bully around Beijing and try to force it to do what it wants, like the US has done with its so-called allies in Europe and South Korea and other countries. China was not willing to be bullied by the US. However, with that said, I emphasized earlier that this is only a battle in a larger trade war that is going to continue. It is certainly not the end. And the FT made it clear that further US-China tensions are inevitable. They noted that most of the agreements between Xi and Trump were relatively narrow, and they mostly suspended existing punitive measures, but did not scrap them altogether. The FT quoted a Chinese scholar who said, quote, this summit can only bring about a tactical détente rather than a strategic reset for the US-China relations, end quote. And I agree. This is a détente. It's a temporary truce. It is not the end at all. Now let's discuss what exactly was agreed to in this Xi-Trump meeting in South Korea. Here is the so-called scorecard that was kept by Bloomberg. So one, the US agreed to lower its fentanyl-related tariffs from 20% to 10%. The US is also suspending the 50% expansion of its US entity list, which is basically a form of sanctions targeting Chinese companies. Trump is backing away from the 100% tariff threat on China, and the US is suspending ship fees. Those were the US concessions. On the other side, China is giving up its rare earth controls, and China is going to resume buying American soybeans, although China was already buying those soybeans before. So this is not really a new concession made by China. And maybe China will agree to buy energy from the US. That's what Trump floated, but there's not actually an agreement on that yet. That's a hypothetical. And then finally, China agreed to crack down on the export of chemicals that are used to make fentanyl, although China already had some restrictions on that. And maybe there will be some kind of agreement on TikTok. But again, this is not clear. It's completely ambiguous. So in reality, China is not making very many concessions, which is why, as Bloomberg put it, China is giving up less than what the US gave up. Bloomberg concludes that China won this round of the trade war. This was also the conclusion of the Associated Press. As the AP put it, the deal between the US and China is undoing the damage of a self-inflicted trade war. The AP quoted an influential economist at a prestigious US university, Cornell, who said, quote, it is hard to see what major gains the US has made in the bilateral relationship relative to where things stood before Trump took office, end quote. So basically, after months and months of Trump escalating against China and attacking China, we're back to square one. We're basically back to January when Trump entered office again. Now, this is quite funny because if we go back to April, when Trump massively escalated the trade war on China, Trump's Treasury Secretary, the billionaire hedge fund manager Scott Bessent, claimed that the US had all the cards and China was playing with a, quote, losing hand, end quote. He claimed that the US had so much leverage over China and that Beijing would completely surrender amid Trump's threats. That's clearly the exact opposite of what has happened since then. I remember making videos back then in which I argued and looked at a lot of evidence that I'll review today. I showed that actually the US is more dependent on China than vice versa. And this is not 2000. 20 years ago, 25 years ago, China was very dependent on trade with the United States. But in the past 2 decades, China has significantly reduced its dependence on trade with the US and export to the US market. And today, the US only represents around 10% of China's overall trade. And China represents around 11% of the US overall trade. But China still has some clear advantages. When I was doing my original analysis back in April when Trump launched this new phase of the trade war, I analyzed what exactly the US exports to China and what China exports to the US. And you can see that the most important goods that China exports to the US include many technologies that the US simply cannot produce, like cell phones and computers and electric batteries and electrical transformers and other electrical machinery and car parts. We're no longer in the 1990s or early 2000s when the majority of China's exports to the US were low value added goods like furniture and toys and household appliances. China has very quickly moved up the global value chain. And the reality is that the US simply cannot replace many of these technologies that it imports from China. Now, if you look at what the US exports to China, on the other hand, yes, the US does export a few high-tech goods that China cannot replace, especially integrated circuits, advanced semiconductors. However, many of the other goods that the US exports to China can easily be replaced. This includes things like crude petroleum and gas and soybeans and corn. These are commodities that many other countries produce. China can import them from somewhere else. The US did used to export cars to China, but now China has become the world's #1 producer of cars. And most people in China prefer buying cars from Chinese companies because they're cheaper and they're of better quality. So the reality is that overall, the US is more dependent on trade with China. Now, many people in the Trump administration, like Bessent and Trump himself, think that the economy of China today is like the economy of China in the 80s and 90s, when China was making very low value added, labor intensive goods of low quality. China has massively boosted its technological capabilities. And today, China is the world's manufacturing superpower, leading in the vast majority of industries. This is why the Financial Times published a report in which it concluded that China exports a lot of advanced tech to the US that the US cannot source from anywhere else. And the FT published this chart using data from Harvard showing how the US is actually dependent on importing high-value tech, including machinery, telecommunications equipment, vehicles, and semiconductors, and also a lot of machine parts that it cannot get from anywhere else, whereas China imports a lot of fuel, energy from the US, which it can get from many other countries. So what we've seen over the past 2 decades is that the Chinese government has used industrial policy, state-led development policies, and planning, central planning, in order to move up the global value chain and increase its technological self-sufficiency so it's no longer as dependent on the US. So in the past 20 years, China has become less reliant on exporting to the US market, while at the same time, US industry has become much more reliant on importing inputs, industrial inputs from China, which are needed for the advanced manufacturing in the US. Economists at the firm Gavekal concluded that the US is more reliant on inputs from China in all of the following industries: agriculture, manufacturing, including electronics, motor vehicles, and machinery, utilities, construction, services, and in general, the whole economy average. And yet, despite all of this evidence, top US officials simply drank the Kool-Aid. They believed in their own propaganda. They believed that China's economy was a basket case and that, as Scott Bessent said, the US had all the cards. China was playing with a losing hand. China is completely dependent on access to the US market. exporting to the US market. In reality, if you look at data in most Chinese industry, the vast majority of revenue comes from domestic purchases. Yes, China is dependent on exporting electronics, especially consumer electronics. But overall, in the vast majority of China's industries, it is actually domestic revenue that makes up the vast majority of overall revenue. And even when you look at the export revenue in aggregate, the US does represent an important part, but it's still only a minority of the overall export revenue. And there are other countries around the world. Even if China is simply exporting to Vietnam or Mexico or Indonesia or Thailand, and then maybe companies in those countries are adding a bit more value to the product and then exporting it to the US, it doesn't matter. Chinese exporters are only concerned about selling the good. They don't care if it ultimately goes to the US. They just want to sell it. And this is actually, by the way, good for countries like Vietnam and Mexico and Indonesia that are developing their own manufacturing sector and taking advantage of the US trade war against China. So what this shows overall is that this is why the US has been losing the trade war against China that Donald Trump started. And of course, it was continued by Joe Biden and the Democrats. This is bipartisan. It's not just Trump. But now that Trump is in his second term as US president, he massively escalated the trade war on China. And he believed the propaganda claiming that the US had all the cards and China had a bad hand. But, you know, as people joked on social media, China makes the cards. The US has deindustrialized. China is the world's manufacturing superpower. And that's why I'm not surprised at all that China has been winning this trade war. So I think all this explains why Trump ultimately came to this agreement. And let's keep in mind, it was the US that was pressuring China to come to the negotiating table, not vice versa. China was fine waiting longer. It was the US that was increasingly desperate. And as the Financial Times put it, this is simply a one-year truce. The FT quoted an analyst from the hawkish US think tank CSIS, which, by the way, is an anti-China think tank. They're not in any way pro-China. But this analyst acknowledged that China's President Xi, quote, stared down Trump and Trump blinked. Xi has mastered managing Trump. Meeting US threats with larger threats has gotten Washington to back down, end quote. Now, of course, if you listen to Trump, he's claiming the exact opposite. In his typical bombastic fashion, Trump claimed that it was an amazing meeting with President Xi, and he claimed on a scale of 0 to 10, with 10 being the best, the meeting was a 12. Now, this is because Trump will never admit when he loses. He doesn't want to acknowledge the fact that he started the trade war on China, and yet he has been losing. And this is especially because midterm elections are coming up in the US in just 1 year, in 2026, and Trump and the Republicans are already focusing on those elections. I think this is a big reason why Trump wanted this 1 year truce. I would not be surprised if after the midterm elections, Trump restarts the trade war on China. But Trump was afraid that continuing to escalate the trade war on China would blow back on the US economy and hurt the Republican Party's chances in the upcoming midterm elections, especially because polling by groups like Pew Research shows that the Republican Party and Trump are very unpopular. Although, of course, I should point out that the Democrats are also unpopular. Both parties are very unpopular. The majority of Americans say the Republican Party is too extreme in its positions, and the majority of Americans do not think that the Republican Party governs in an honest way. Although I should point out that they feel the same about the Democrats. I'm not trying to defend the Democrats here. I'm just being objective and looking at the facts. And they show that Trump and the Republicans are simply not popular. In fact, the latest polling from The Economist from the 31st of October found that 284 days into Trump's second term, his net approval rating is negative 18%, and it has continuously fallen throughout Trump's term. Only 39% of Americans approve of Trump's policies. 57%, nearly 3/5 of Americans disapprove of Trump's policies. And it makes sense that most Americans feel this way because Trump's policies have been hurting average working class Americans. especially Trump's tariffs. Goldman Sachs published data in October that found that US consumers are bearing more than half of the cost of Trump's tariffs. Economists at this major US bank estimated that US consumers are paying 55% of the costs of these tariffs. Now, Trump has falsely claimed for years that other countries pay tariffs. That's a lie. It is not true. Tariffs are a tax on consumption, and it is importers in the country where the tariffs are imposed that pay the tariffs. So US importers pay the tariffs. Companies in the US that import goods from China pay the tariffs, not China, not Chinese exporters. And ultimately, US importers, US companies, usually they pass down the costs of those tariffs to customers in the form of higher prices. So Trump has been increasing taxes, consumption taxes on working class Americans with these tariffs, which is a form of regressive taxation. And again, Goldman Sachs estimated that 55% of those tariffs are paid by Americans, and that figure is likely going to increase, especially as Trump imposes more tariffs. So US consumers are going to struggle more and more with higher prices. We've already seen that consumer price inflation in the US has been persistently high. The main measure for this in the US is the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. And as of September 2025, it was at 3% compared to the previous year. This is significantly above the 2% target that is usually set by the US Federal Reserve, the US Central Bank. And you can see that consumer price inflation has been rising ever since Trump imposed massive tariffs on countries around the world in April 2025. Now, obviously, yes, inflation is not nearly as high as it was in 2022 coming out of the pandemic. It peaked at around 9%, which is likely a conservative estimate. But the point is that inflation in the US has remained hot, and the data shows it's increasing, not decreasing under Trump, which is very ironic because inflation was basically the main reason that Trump won the 2024 US presidential election. It was not because Americans agreed with all of Trump's very right-wing policies. It was because of the inflation crisis coming out of the pandemic, which was a global inflation crisis, of course, but the Biden administration did not handle it well, especially coming out of the pandemic. The rich have gotten much, much richer, and poor and working class people are struggling. And Trump claimed that he would solve the economic issues and bring down inflation. Of course, he's only made inflation worse. He has not solved these deep economic structural issues. I mean, Trump's policies have benefited billionaires like him, but the Democrats did not actually propose pro-working class policies that would solve these economic problems. So Trump won because he had a simplistic message claiming that he was going to solve all of these economic problems by deporting immigrants, which did not work. It's actually making things worse, and by imposing tariffs, which are also making things worse. In fact, Trump also claimed that he was going to reindustrialize the US and bring back good manufacturing jobs. But in fact, the data shows that in his first year as president, the number of manufacturing jobs has been falling, not increasing. From April to October 2025, 42,000 manufacturing jobs in the US disappeared. And a lot of this is because of the uncertainty surrounding Trump's tariffs and trade war. CBS News reported that for all of 2025, 33,000 manufacturing jobs were lost in the US. And these were jobs making goods like cars, household appliances, and electronics. Many of these were good, well-paid jobs, steady jobs for working class families. And the main reason for the loss of these jobs in manufacturing is uncertainty, again, because of Trump's tariffs. If you look at the data from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, you can see that when Trump entered office in January until April, manufacturing employment was pretty steady. In fact, it slightly increased. And then in April, when Trump started this new trade war, what happened? The number of manufacturing jobs in the US fell significantly, which is the exact opposite of what Trump claimed his tariffs would do. This is yet another example of how Trump's trade war has not been helping average working class Americans. It's been doing the exact opposite. Now, another group in the US that was hit hard by Trump's trade war in China was farmers, especially those who produce soybeans, who rely very heavily on exporting to the Chinese market. Now, as part of the agreement that was made between Trump and China's President Xi in South Korea in October, the Trump administration boasted that China will be buying soybeans from US farmers. Scott Bessent said this was a major victory for the Trump administration and that China will buy 12 million metric tons of US soybeans. That sounds like a lot of soybeans, right? But if you look at the details, what you see is that in reality, this number is actually a decrease compared to what China purchased from US soybean farmers in the prior season. Last season, China bought 22.5 million tons of US soybeans. Now they're going to buy about half of that, 12 million tons. So this is not a major concession here by China. In reality, what happened is that China was already buying soybeans from the US, and then China paused its import of soybeans in response to Trump's aggressive unilateral trade war. And now China is going back to buying soybeans like earlier. So from China's perspective, nothing changed. Trump's trade war did not actually result in any gains for the US, at least in this area. Meanwhile, US farmers have been going through severe economic pain. As Reuters put it, quote, "The drop in Chinese demand cost US farmers, a key pillar of Trump's political base, billions of dollars in lost sales, and the deal would represent a return to normalcy in trade," end quote. So Trump was hurting his own voters. The majority of US farmers voted for Donald Trump. He hurt them, and now we're back to square one, exactly where things were before Trump entered office, before his escalation of this trade war on China. And again, what this shows is that when Scott Bessent claimed that the US held all the cards and China was more dependent on the US, it was actually the opposite of reality. China is less dependent on the US because what China said is fine. We're going to stop importing soybeans from the US, and instead, China massively increased its imports of soybeans from Argentina. China also increased its purchases of soybeans from Brazil, which has become a major ally of China, a major trading partner. Brazil is the B in BRICS. It's one of the co-founders of BRICS. So China has alternatives to the US. Again, the Trump administration, these top US officials drank their own Kool-Aid, which is always very dangerous. And I should point out that this is not surprising at all if you actually study the facts of what happened during Trump's first term when he launched the trade war on China. And what happened? 92% of the tariff proceeds, of the revenue that the US government made from Trump's tariffs between 2018 and 2020, nearly all of it, 92% of it, was paid to US farmers as a bailout in the form of subsidies and relief payments. So Trump has claimed that supposedly his tariffs are going to raise all of this revenue, which, by the way, again, I need to repeat this. That revenue comes from American consumers. It is a tax on working class Americans, on consumption. It is a very regressive tax that especially hits poor and working class Americans the hardest because they spend a much larger percentage of their paycheck on basic staples like food compared to rich people who only spend a small percentage of their income and wealth on food. But again, Trump used that revenue during his first term that he raised from tariffs in order to bail out US farmers who were hurt by his trade war. And by the way, the Trump administration has already been talking about another bailout of farmers now during Trump's second term. Trump has been considering a $10 billion bailout for US farmers because they've been hurting due to his escalation of the trade war on China. So once again, when you hear Trump boast about all of the revenue he's raising from tariffs, you need to keep in mind that a lot of that money is actually going to pay bailouts and subsidies because of the damage caused by his trade war. And again, that money is not coming from foreign countries and foreign companies. It's coming from American consumers paying a tax in the form of tariffs. Now, with all of that said, one of the biggest and most important takeaways of China's victory in this round of the trade war is the importance of rare earths. China completely dominates the global rare earth supply chain, including both the mining and especially the processing and refining of rare earths. China made up more than 60% of the mining of rare earths as of 2024, and over 90% of the refining of rare earths. Now, despite the name, rare earths are actually not that rare. They can be found in many countries around the world. But what makes it difficult for other countries to replace China in the supply chain is the processing of rare earths is very labor intensive and it's very complex. And most countries do not have the technology and the supply chains developed needed to actually process rare earths. If you look at a chart visualizing China's dominance in the global production of rare earth metals, I mean, it's just, there's no comparison. No country even remotely comes close. The US role is very minor. In the past few years, especially after Trump launched the trade war against China in his first term as president, the US has increased its share of the global rare earth industry. But again, it's just very minor, and it's going to take many years, if not decades, for the US to try to catch up. Now, when China responded to Trump's aggressive trade war, and in an act of self-defense, China restricted the export of rare earths to the US, that freaked out Washington, and it freaked out the military-industrial complex in particular, because US tech companies, and especially US military contractors, arms manufacturers, are very dependent on China's processing of rare earths. The US military cannot produce the weapons it needs to prepare for war on China without China's rare earths. This is why the US government in the past decade has been pouring resources into try to develop a new supply chain for critical minerals and especially rare earth elements that cuts out China. Because in Washington, hawks are preparing for a potential war with China. And as they prepare for war, they can't be dependent on critical minerals coming from China. As China has shown, if the US attacks China, China can restrict the export of critical minerals to the US and cut off US industry. This was a major Achilles heel that was exposed in the US by Trump's trade war. And if you read the journals and the media outlets of the US military industrial complex, they acknowledge, US military contractors acknowledge that the US cannot realistically catch up in the production of rare earths. As the US media outlet National Defense put it, the US cannot dig itself out of the critical minerals hole. This is a huge issue. Now, we should always keep in mind here that the reason that China put those restrictions on is because it was responding to US attacks on China. It was the US that started this trade war in Trump's first administration, but the Democrats, Joe Biden, continued the trade war on China that was started under Trump and the Republicans. Unfortunately, the new Cold War, Cold War II, is completely bipartisan in Washington. And let's not forget that it was Joe Biden that put very significant restrictions on the export of advanced technologies and especially semiconductors to the US. The Biden administration restricted the export of advanced chips, advanced chip making tools, and semiconductor technology to China. And the idea in Washington was that this would be China's Achilles heel. They said China will not be able to catch up to the US in new cutting edge industries, especially artificial intelligence. US big tech corporations in Silicon Valley will have a monopoly on AI. China will be left behind. That is, of course, not what happened. Now, just as China's restrictions on the export of rare earths have caused the US government to pour resources and to develop its own supply chain for critical minerals, the same thing has been happening with semiconductors. The US restrictions on the exports of semiconductors to China have inspired China to massively develop its own domestic chip-making industry. And now China is dominating the global chip market. So yes, China has not caught up in the most advanced chips, but China is dominating what are known as legacy chips, which are the chips used in most everyday technologies. Biden's Commerce Secretary, Gina Raimondo, who was waging this trade war and tech war on China in the Biden administration, she acknowledged in 2024 that around 60% of all new legacy chips coming into the market in the next several years will be produced by China, the majority of chips. And the Chinese government has made this a huge priority through its industrial policy, through its state-led campaign to move up the value chain and to produce higher value-added, more advanced semiconductors. This is why the Chinese government has restricted Chinese tech companies from buying chips from the US company NVIDIA, which is now, the biggest company in the world by market capitalization, now with over a $5 trillion market cap, which is crazy because NVIDIA basically has a monopoly on these most advanced chips. So now the Chinese government has been saying, we're going to pour resources and government support to develop our own advanced semiconductors. And this is at the heart of China's new 5-year plan. China, it does have a market economy, but it has a socialist market economy with key parts of the economy publicly owned by the government. And still, there are elements of planning that are used, especially in strategic industries. Every 5 years, the Communist Party issues a new 5-year plan. And the latest 5-year plan for 2026 to 2030 heavily emphasizes the importance of technological upgrading, moving up the global value chain. And in particular, the new 5-year plan calls for extraordinary measures to have new breakthroughs in advanced chip production. And if you look at China's past planning, its past goals, it has met the vast majority of those goals. A good example of this is the Made in China 2025 initiative. This was a plan announced back in 2015, and the Chinese government set goals to become globally competitive in many important tech industries. And Bloomberg concluded that China was very successful in almost all of the industries it targeted. China is now the global leader in unmanned aerial vehicles, that's drones, solar panels, graphene, high-speed rail, and electric vehicles and lithium batteries. And China will soon be the global leader in carriers of liquefied natural gas, LNG. And China is also very competitive globally in the production of advanced drugs, large tractors, machine tools, robots, artificial intelligence, and semiconductors. The only area where China is not yet competitive is commercial aircraft, but China is very likely to catch up in the next few years. So when the Chinese government makes plans, unlike the US government, which almost never actually meets its goals, China usually meets almost all of its goals. Not all of them, it's not perfect, but it comes very close to meeting its goals. This was actually admitted by a Western think tank that is in fact very anti-China called ASPI, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. This is a hawkish anti-China think tank that is backed by the Australian military and funded by multiple Western governments. And yet they published a report admitting that China is dominating global technology and scientific research. They concluded, reluctantly, but they concluded that China is currently leading in 57 out of 64 critical technologies. That is 89% of the critical technologies they are tracking, which is an incredible increase in just 2 decades. 20 years before, in the 2003 to the 2007 period, China was only leading in 3 technologies out of 64. Now it's 57 out of 64. And this report, again, it's an anti-China think tank, they warned that the US is in fact losing the strong historical advantage that it had built. Back in the 2003 to 2007 period, the US was leading in 60 out of 64 technologies. Now the US is only leading in 7 technologies in the 2019 to 2023 period. This is a tectonic shift in just 2 decades. China has become the world's technological and manufacturing superpower, in no small part due to government planning and industrial policy. And yet China continues to advance. China is not just giving up and surrendering to the US in semiconductors and artificial intelligence and commercial aircraft. China also plans on developing very competitive domestic industries in those sectors as well. A key part of its next 5-year plan is what China refers to as, quote, technological self-reliance, end quote. So China will not suffer from the trade war that the US is very likely going to continue. Like I said, this is not the end of the trade war. This is just a temporary truce in this trade war. So you can see why hawks in Washington from both parties, Republicans and Democrats, are freaking out about the fact that China has been leading in some advanced industries. And this explains why the US has been so aggressive attacking China in this trade war, in this tech war, that again started under Trump, but also accelerated under Biden. This is bipartisan. So if you look at all of the evidence, it becomes very clear that Trump's trade war has been a failure, especially his trade war against China. Now, he's also waging a trade war against other countries. I don't have time to get into that today, but it is very clear from the evidence that China won this round of the trade war. And again, I want to go back to these absurd comments made by the billionaire hedge fund manager turned U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, who claimed that China was playing with a losing hand and the U.S. had all the cards. We can now very obviously see today that that was not true. It is actually the exact opposite. China is less dependent on the U.S. than vice versa. I'm not saying that China is completely independent. It's not. But China clearly won this round of the trade war. The war will still go on, but China has won this battle and Trump lost this battle. On that note, I'm going to wrap up. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. I am Ben Norton. I am the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. Please like and subscribe.
Letting the US know, hey, you can hit us with 100% tariffs, but check out these controls on rare earth minerals that we can use against you. We know that these tensions are nowhere near over, but what should we be keeping an eye on when it comes to the talks that just unfolded and what it means for the overall relationship between the US and China? Well, we got into all of that and more with a special guest earlier, so let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is KJ No, a journalist, geopolitical analyst, and co-host of the China Report on Breakthrough News. KJ, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
Pleasure to be with you, Rachel.
It's great to have you on the show. Now, I want to get your take on the latest here, as I know that U.S. President Trump met with Chinese President Xi Jinping in person for the first time since 2019 on Thursday, with talks held in South Korea. And the two leaders did agree to essentially extend their current truce. You have China agreeing to postpone restrictions on exports of crucial rare earths for a year, while the U.S. will stay its tariff of 100% on Chinese goods and its threat of export controls on subsidiaries of blacklisted Chinese firms. China will also resume its purchase of American soybeans, and reports say that Trump appears open to the export of some semiconductor chips. Okay, that was a lot, but how do you view these talks and really what they mean for the ongoing tensions between the US and China?
Well, I think there are all kinds of takes that I'm seeing from different sides, but I think the key takeaway to this, and I think it's possible to make a strong argument for this, is that the US blinked. That is to say, the US issued the threat and then it withdrew the threat because the counterparty counter-threatened. And that is always a sign of weakness. You know, if you make the threat, you either sustain it or you keep moving forward or something. But the US backed down, the US de-escalated. So clearly, I think the US was in the weaker position, and that has to do with simply the nature of the rare earth elements, the controls that China was threatening on rare earth elements would have actually deindustrialized the United States. And we know that the current US economy is buoyed up by the AI bubble. I mean, if you take out the AI bubble, the US GDP growth essentially is almost flat. So the US is heading over an economic cliff. There's an AI bubble, which is, keeping things afloat. And when China issued the rare earth element controls, that I think really was a near-death experience for Besant and the U.S. economy in general. And so they said, we need to back down from this. And you can see that they've pulled off almost everything that they have threatened. The tariffs have been going up and down. They've been fibrillating like crazy, but they essentially pulled off their tariffs. They pulled off their blacklisting. And they are, as you said, they're extending a truce. They're extending, their hand in, a temporary ceasefire. I think the other thing to remember, China has removed, apparently, and all of this bears written confirmation, but China has removed or suspended the rare earth controls that they imposed in October for 1 year. So we'll see if it holds on past 1 year, because it's still a very imminent threat. But the thing is, they also put rare earth controls in April and December of last year. And those, as far as I can tell, will still be in place. And so the US arms manufacturers and large parts of the US industry are still very, very much under, the rare earth element threat.
Okay, and that's good to know, especially when you see this back and forth. And it is interesting to kind of watch Trump speaking so highly of these talks, right? He's saying that they were amazing, that it was a 12 out of 10, making it look like the US really got the upper hand here. But even the New York Times is summing this up with the headline, "The Art of Letting Trump Claim a Win While Walking Away Stronger," where they note that by withholding soybean purchases and rare earth exports, China extracted relief from US tariffs and delayed export controls without conceding much in return. They also said that Mr. Xi's message seemed to be Beijing had proven its capacity to hit back, and Washington would do well to remember it. So how do you view the position that China is currently in? Because obviously it's still dealing with this US establishment that is planning for a future war between Washington and Beijing. And yet China's also in this place of continuing diplomacy, right? Trying to kind of convince the US in a way that, hey, we can work together and keep on with these partnerships, but you also have to pay attention to the reality of the situation. And they're telling that to a Trump administration that has never met reality a day in their life.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I don't think this administration is tethered to reality. They're simply high on their own supply, telling themselves the lies that make themselves feel good and, puffing themselves up. But I think what we can take away from this exchange is that Beijing will not be bullied. And when it is bullied, it will hit back hard. And of course, they'll give a face-saving, exit for the United States. So they'll, buy some soybeans and whey. They'll make, the Midwestern soy boys happy. But they will hit back, and then they'll give a face-saving, way for the United States to de-escalate. But the larger picture is that the United States is still waging hybrid war against China. It does not want to let China challenge its hegemony, as far as we can tell, although the hawks are right now very desperate and they're also very depressed. But they don't want, if possible, to let go of their control of the planet. And they certainly there's certainly many things that indicate that they continue to escalate in other fields. And so inside that, larger context, once again, I think it's important to note that the U.S. tried really hard to bully China, and then it ended up backing down. And once again, the rare earth elements are critical. China's been building out rare earth elements for about 50 years. That industry is 50 years old and it's matured. And anything that it relates to electronics, transduction, displays, speakers, earbuds, luminescence, magnetism, anything, motors, navigation, all of that is rare earth elements. And so they really have the United States in a very, very difficult position. And I think there's a little bit of reality dawning there, but we'll have to watch and see.
Yeah, it is interesting to watch this play out as, the US, and exactly as you're noting there, right? China has known this for 50 years. They figured out that, okay, refining the rare earth elements is the key to essentially everything, right? But the US, they watch this happen. They rely on China. They watch China build out its industry. And then all of a sudden they get to 2025 and they're like, oh crap, we want war against China, but that's not really possible right now. What do we do here? And it is the egos that you see that are definitely playing a role here. I also thought it was interesting bringing it back to some of these, mainstream media articles that we're seeing this week, because The Atlantic published an article with the headline, "The US is on track to lose a war with China," in which they note that modern warfare is decided by production capacity and technological mastery, not by individual valor. And this, of course, comes as you have Defense Secretary, War Secretary, whatever you want to call him, Pete Hegseth, acting as though, oh, the US military just has to be brave enough, strong enough, manly enough, whatever it may be. That's how they're going to take on a country like China. But as this article rightfully points out, look, you may think that you're going in and that this is a real competition, but China has things figured out in a way that the US only wishes it could. So how do you view the position that Washington is in and kind of the state of plans for this future war against China?
Well, The Atlantic makes a good point, although it's, I think, almost commonsensical, which is that when a financial power, and the US is a financial power, goes to war against an industrial power, the industrial power always wins. This has historically been the case. The country with the largest industrial power, with the best logistics and supply chains, they win, because ultimately war is a matter of industrial capacity and physical items, physical things. And so the US is starting to realize, and The Atlantic points out, that the US would lose. But the question that the Atlantic never asks is, why is the US going to go to war with China? Why should it even consider a war with China? Instead, it takes war with China as a given. And then it says, well, we need to, think about this, reindustrialize, because we could lose this. And so, that already gives you a sense of the mental framework from which the ruling elite and their elite magazines are functioning from. So inside that context, absolutely right. Currently there's a lot of, posturing and talking about, lethality and warfighting capacity, but wars are won or lost on the basis of logistics and industrial capacity. And is this an acknowledgement in the general ruling elite that they're starting to understand this? We're seeing a lot of articles in this vein right now, in The Economist, in other kind of ruling class and elite journals. They're saying things like, the general sense you get is that the China hawks are depressed. And I think that's a good thing, because they're starting to, realize a little bit of what's going on. The other thing that's probably driving them crazy is that Elbridge Colby, when he, designed this plan of war against China, it was all about getting other countries to gang up on China, with the US as the lead bully. And because Trump has been, having this scattershot approach to all countries with these tariffs, they've actually, alienated all these countries that, Colby and others would have liked to have leveraged and used against China. So I think, that's another reason why they're so depressed and, face palming themselves.
Yeah, that is truly the irony, right? This idea that, oh, because that was what the Biden administration tried so hard to do. And maybe I guess they tried a version of it, right? Where they were like, okay, we're going to get all of these smaller countries on board. We're going to, get them to turn against China. Clearly that didn't work. And then Trump comes in and makes the situation even worse. And I thought it was notable. I know that there was a lot when it came to kind of the lead up between this meeting between Trump and Xi of what are they going to talk about, right? Obviously tariffs, obviously rare earths. There was a question of TikTok. There's also a question about Taiwan. And it's not clear what all was said about Taiwan, but I did find it notable that a spokesperson for China's Taiwan Affairs Office said this week that, quote, "We are willing to create ample space for peaceful reunification and will spare no effort to pursue this prospect with the utmost sincerity. However, we absolutely will not renounce the use of force and reserve the option to take all necessary measures." Now, I know the West goes, oh, the use of force, right? That's all that they focus on out of that entire statement. But given the fact that Taiwan's current leader is calling for the island to resist the advancement of reunification altogether, what are your concerns for the current tensions surrounding Taiwan?
Well, it's very interesting what's going on with Taiwan right now. I think the Chinese are sending a message to Taiwan. Do not get ideas, certainly about, secession, which is kind of the ultimate red line. The Chinese will not tolerate secession because, they frame it, Taiwan says, we're independent, we want to be independent. It's nonsense. There's no such thing as Taiwan independence. It is essentially a US vassal. And if it secedes from China or moves further along that spectrum towards secession, it's simply become more and more of a US, proxy. And we know that the United States has been, over the past 5 years, slowly Ukrainizing it, trying to turn it into the East Asian version of Ukraine as a casus belli to initiate or trigger war against China. And there are many, many reasons why it's such a dangerous and risky flashpoint. And the ruling elite, the DPP, are they're playing with fire. But I think the other that also played into this was that President Lai Ching-te, he's the U.S. Quisling DPP ruler, said that they have been tightening their connections with Israel, and they've hosted a dinner for the Israeli lobby AIPAC, and they have said that we look to Israel as our model of how we're going to deal with China. We are going to resist China using the model of Israel. And that, I think, is an extraordinary inflammatory statement to say. Essentially, they're saying that we're, willing to, genocide, our opponents. And so I think that's possibly another reason why, there's a kind of a stronger affirmation that they will not tolerate, that they will not rule out the use of force against the threat of force and the threat of secession. Once again, even in the Western, elite discourse, they're asking themselves, is Lai a loose cannon? Do we need to, tamp him down a little bit because we propped him up like Zelensky because we want to Ukrainize Taiwan, but do we also need to cut him down a few notches? And there's been some of that public berating, and the foreign ministry is saying, we're not loose cannons, etc. So it's an interesting dynamic that's going on there.
Yeah, that is really interesting, especially when you look at the fact that Zelensky has also kind of had statements like that, right? He's like, yeah, we want to be like Israel. Give us all the money, give us all of the weapons, and we will be a version, basically offering himself up as a further US proxy. But when you look at how things have fared for Israel, yes, they have committed genocide for the last 2 years. It has been horrific and terrible for the Palestinian people. There is no argument there, but it's also been bad for Israel, right? Israel's not exactly in a great standpoint right now. They're not having any sort of better relations with their neighbors. In fact, their neighbors look at them with even more of a side eye now, going, what is Israel going to do? What war are they going to wage next, right? They want further war with Iran. So when you look at, a country like Ukraine or a self-ruling island like Taiwan, and you go, okay, they seem to really want to quote unquote be like Israel for the US. What kind of a message do you think is really being sent there? Is this just about getting the funding and getting US support, or is there more to it when it comes to the reality of, hey, we are willing to try to commit a genocide against our neighbor for the US essentially?
I think the LDP, sorry, the DPP, they have a strong tie to the Japanese. Remember, Japan colonized Taiwan for about half a century, and the DPP leadership is actually very close to Japan, and they consider themselves, some of them consider themselves actually to be Japanese and not Chinese, which is absurd on the face of it. But there's a kind of a collaborationist class, just the same as in Korea, who collaborated with Japan, and those descendants have maintained strong ties with Japan and still hold Japan as their model. Now, once again, Japan is not a good model if for any sane individual, because, the Japanese were genocidal all over Asia. They killed off 35 million Chinese just for starters. So I think the message here is that what the U.S. has done, it has put in extreme elements that are very, very right-wing, nationalist, fascistic in their ideology, and it has pumped them up, just as it did in Ukraine with Zelensky. And now it's having to deflate that a little bit, because they don't know if they are ready to go to war right away. Remember, the Minahan window and the Davidson window said we're going to war with China between 2025 and 2027. And Taiwan is understood by everybody to be the key trigger, which is why Japan has been preparing missiles and weapons on Yonaguni Island, which is, practically swimming distance from Taiwan, and why the entire First Island chain has been turned into, a massive wall of missiles. But I think they may be having a little bit of a kind of a de-escalatory pause, because they're recalibrating. There's so many pieces that are shifting on the chessboard right now. I think they need to take a little tactical pause and see, how do we recalibrate our strategies? How do we recalibrate? How do we reload? How do we re-industrialize? It's not going to happen, but at least they're starting to think about, the importance of industrialization. And then how do we sort out the mess that we're creating by threatening all our allies, even as we try and use them to bully and attack China? The strategy is a mess, and they're trying to sort it out. And they're also trying to keep Taiwan from becoming too much of a loose cannon.
Yeah, it's very telling there. I know a lot of these strategies that we see in policy papers, we may think, okay, that's going to happen during this specific date and time and window. But it's always interesting to see how those strategies don't change, but sometimes the timing does, because you still have all of those hawks in Washington who they still want war with China, but I guess, are at least realistic enough to kind of realize, okay, now is not the smartest time to make this move, but that can also change very quickly. There is a lot at stake here all around, and I always appreciate you taking the time to join me to break down all of the latest here. KJ Noh, a journalist, geopolitical analyst, and co-host of the China Report
this trade war was the wrong trade war for the United States to start the fight to start with. My concern is that the greatest predictability in the world of today is the unpredictability of the United States. And the greatest certainty in the world of today is the uncertainty of the United States and, unfortunately, President Trump.
Hello and welcome to The Forecast. After months of a vicious cycle of mutual retaliation, as Xi Jinping has put it, Donald Trump and the Chinese leader seem to have come to a truce in their first meeting in nearly 6 years. Speaking in South Korea, Xi agreed to stop withholding China's rare earth exports for a year and start buying soybeans from America again, while Donald Trump said that he would reduce tariffs and suspend port fees on Chinese ships. But how long will this amicable relationship last? Will all of this signal a closer tie between the world's two biggest economies? Well, to discuss this, I'm joined now by Victor Gao, Vice President of the Center for China and Globalization in Beijing, and Dr. Yu Jie, Senior Research Fellow on China at Chatham House. Welcome to you both. Let me start with you, Yu Jie. Is the trade war over? Has it been suspended? And who's won, if anyone?
Well, the truth is, it's not over yet. What we have right now is a temporary ceasefire between the world's two largest economies. Really, if you're judging from the details the two sides has been offered for now, I think we'll come to the stage that both ends and realize how difficult it is and how dependent each other is towards the economy, and has this a necessary ceasefire for the moment. However, I think really judging from the words, very cautious words from the Chinese state media, here is to say the protracted competition with the United States, difficult relationship between Beijing and Washington is really here to stay. So I think what we have today is both leaders realize politically it's important to have this temporary ceasefire.
Victor, Donald Trump, after the meeting, said on Air Force One that the meeting had been amazing. Was it amazing for Xi Jinping?
No. Definitely not. This trade war was the wrong trade war for the United States to start the fight to start with. China is on the receiving side, and whatever China is doing is in retaliation against the wrongful acts by the United States. And now the United States have felt the heat from the Chinese side, has blinked again and again. I think the United States realized that it is futile for the United States to try to achieve a chokehold against China, because China has enough wherewithal to fight back. This is the reason why the two sides have decided to back off from each other, at least temporarily. And I think going forward, the litmus test is whether the United States really honors whatever it has agreed in the summit meeting in the Republic of Korea. And that will decide whether China will again retaliate against whatever the United States may want to change from what they agreed in South Korea.
But as Yu Jie said, they need each other. And hasn't, really the saga, the up and down, the trade war of the last 9 months since Trump took office again, shown us, Victor, that actually they do rely on each other. China needs America's markets. America needs China's rare earth metals, just, to mention two items.
Absolutely. China and the United States can do each other better if they really respect each other and deal with each other as equal. If the United States wants to bully China and try to suffocate China, first of all, it will not succeed. Secondly, it will really suffer the retaliation from China. China has never initiated this round of trade war or tariff war. It is always the United States which wants to fight against China. And I hope by now Washington has fully realized it is futile for the United States to try to suppress China by such wrongful acts of tariff war. And China has demonstrated its consistency in terms of its position and policy of fighting back whenever the United States wants to bully China. And China demands to be treated as a complete equal partner with the United States, rather than anything less than an equal partner.
Yu Jie, do you think that China holds stronger hands in this tussle, or America? Or are they literally both equal, although they want different things, obviously?
Well, I think they're actually both equal, and obviously they want different things. And first and foremost for China, I think what they really want is to increasing its economic strength and also try to enhancing its capability on high-end technology. That is to say, it can withstand geopolitical pressure from the United States and also from the collective West. Now, secondly, I think in here, as I said earlier, politically, both leaders want to have some kind of temporary truce. And for Donald Trump, and he's able to justify to his domestic audience that he has managed his relationship with China, managed tariff issue. Whereas I think really for Beijing, it's really a matter of taking this as a stalling approach, of taking a longer time to buy its time and try to strengthen its own domestic economic resilience. So I think both want this ceasefire, but for very different reasons in here.
Do you think the whole trade war of the last 9-10 months was completely pointless, Yujie?
Well, no, I think surely it is really a sense of testing who has the strengths and who blink first. And obviously, Beijing has really taken a playbook provided by United States, that is to say, using the maximum pressure to your opposition to achieve what I want. And I think that's the playbook Beijing has learned. So it put in a way that I think United States has inadvertently become the best teacher for China and how to be a superpower.
Victor, what's your response to that?
Well, China does not need an additional teacher. China does not want to be a superpower. China just wants to be treated as an equal and on fair basis.
Hang on a minute. I'm going to interrupt you there. You said China doesn't want to be a superpower. Come on. China wants to be a superpower. China is a superpower.
A superpower, by Chinese definition, is some country very abrasive, very much domineering against others, and never treats other countries as an equal. Now, this trade war or the tariff war is completely pointless. It shows that the United States cannot win this trade war. And I hope President Trump will tell the American people that it is the American people who will eventually pay the bulk of all the tariffs charged by the United States against all the other countries, including against China. China will never pay a single penny of the tariff charged by the United States against Chinese export to the United States. Therefore, I truly believe this trade war is really much ado about nothing. It demonstrates the United States doesn't care about free trade. It really wants to throw a wedge into free trade for what? For damaging and ruining its own reputation and respectability.
How can you be so sure that China will go on, Yujie, please weigh in.
Sorry, if I may add in here. I mean, it's not to disregard or disagree with Dr. Gao in here. I think is what we have in here right now is finally a G2 framework, and has been admitted by United States. Really, I'm speaking from the evidence, from the tweet that has been sent to the White House this morning by saying the G2 meeting is about to start. So I think really after this few months of trade war, the United States certainly has treated China as that sense undisputed equal. So I think that's what China wants. And I think that's what Dr. Gao was saying about regarding the respect. I think it's that respect element and what we have as of today.
Victor Gao, you've been quite rude about America and its intentions in the trade war, but Donald Trump has been nothing but polite about your leader, Xi Jinping. He called him a strong leader, a great leader. Why doesn't Xi Jinping return the compliment? Why don't you return the compliment?
I always have the highest respect for the American people and for the ingenuity and the creativity of the United States as a nation. Now, sometimes I'm critical of President Trump and his trade policies. That doesn't mean that Victor Gao has any lack of respect for the American people. Now, for President Trump, while I applaud the fact that he used the nice words, pleasant words about China for President Xi Jinping, we always need to watch whatever he walks, and we cannot purely depend on whatever he talks. Therefore, this is the time to see whether he talks the talk and walks the walk. And this will be the litmus test. I think, and my concern is that the greatest predictability in the world of today is the unpredictability of the United States. And the greatest certainty in the world of today is the uncertainty of the United States. And unfortunately, President Trump.
There are many things that Americans admire about China. I myself was traveling through China for quite a long time in 1981, when it was a very, very different country. Now, so I've seen the extraordinary transformation of China it's mind-blowing, literally. It's extraordinary. I wonder what you, Victor Gao, admire about America.
Well, I have the highest admiration you can think about for the American people, for their creativity, resourcefulness, as well as for their great natural endowment and very unmatched geopolitical positions in the northern part of the United States. And I think whatever China is doing is trying its best to make the United States love peace more, rather than try to resort to war to solve any problem between any other with any other country. This is why China never looks down upon the United States, and China always wants to engage with the United States as an equal partner. And we truly believe that if China and the United States can set their sights on the same major issue in the world, there will be nothing in this world which cannot be resolved for our mutual benefit, as well as for the benefit of mankind as a whole.
Zhu Jie, I mean, Victor Gao loves to talk about, China and peace and how it's a peace-loving country that wants to spread peace around the world. But when you look at China's military buildup, which is also extraordinary, especially its naval buildup in the region, what story does that tell you?
Well, there's plenty of stories in here. I think for the first layer is really that sense of China's obsession regarding neighboring countries, because this is a country share a border with 14 different countries, and obviously having secure border and to be paired with the modern army, and I think that's absolutely necessary. Now, secondly, I think also given Chinese foreign policy's obsession towards sovereignty and territorial integrity, so when it comes to issues related to Taiwan, and when it comes to issues related to South China Sea, of course, and China will show a very assertive stance on that. So I think it's just the way how the Chinese foreign policy and also the military conduct is operate as it is today. And of course, I think for many, and particularly among the G7 countries, when I look at this, and they would consider this probably bring more fear than admiration regarding China's military capability.
What do you think China wants to do with its military capability? What's the end goal here, Zhu Jie?
Well, the end goal is really about deterrence, to win a war without fighting. I mean, if we come back to a month ago with that gigantic military parade to be put forward at Tiananmen Square, and one thing has been quite clear is that the message has been clear there, and that China does have the capability when it comes to the military competition with the United States or with the others. However, whether China decided to use it, that's an entirely different matter.
Victor Gao, is that this parade of military hardware that we saw in Beijing, is the language that comes out of your leader, Xi Jinping, is that about respect? Is it about fear? Is it about domination in the region? What's it about?
Well, the victory parade on September the 3rd has only one purpose. That is to defend China's sovereignty and national territorial integrity, and to make the United States and the American people love peace more than what they used to. And this is the only purpose. China's national defense is not a measure up against any of our neighboring countries. It is a measuring up against only one country, that is the United States. And the only purpose of measuring up against the United States is to make sure that the United States will love peace and will no longer be happy to move to the gun and shoot from the hip, especially not vis-a-vis China. That's the only purpose.
But hang on a minute, Victor. It is Chinese components that allow the Russians to fire missiles and drones into Ukraine. China could stop the war in Ukraine today if Xi Jinping picked up the phone to Vladimir Putin and said, we can be the best of friends, but you cannot wage this war. He has refused to do that. He has met Vladimir Putin together with the North Korean leader at that parade on the 3rd of September. I mean, these are not exactly peace-loving signals, are they?
You are wrong, with due respect. If China supplies weapons to the Russian side, Russia would have won the war overnight. For example, China has this most lethal anti-drone weapon and system, which can shoot down any group of drones en masse. And this is exactly what the Russians would need, because drones launched and used by the Ukrainians have done havoc against Russia, not only inside the Ukraine, but deep inside Russia. This is ample proof to show that China does not supply weapons to either Russia or Ukraine. And if China supplies weapon to either side, that side receiving China weapon will win the war immediately.
Zhu Jie, is any of that right?
Well, I think regarding the Russia, Ukraine, and China, and that's an entire separate question. But what we can really judging from the meeting what we had today, I think President Trump even mentioned that was much hoping that can work together with China to resolve this war in Ukraine related matters. So let's see whether the G2, the framework which we just had this morning, will be able to solve the Ukraine-Russia issue for now. But I think at the moment, we have seen a lot of words floating around and very little deeds that how much, firstly, Washington get involved, and secondly, how much Beijing would like to get involved on European security architecture.
But if China was not providing the kind of overtly non-military aid to Russia that it's been providing, for the last 2 years or 2.5 years of the war, do you think that Russia would not be able to conduct this war as it has done so far?
Well, I think weapon is one thing, but another element in here is this regular trade between China and Russia, and also the volumes of trade and that Beijing has purchased from Russia. That somehow give the bloodline to running the economy. So it's less about the weapon, but I think it's more about the trading relationship that Beijing has offered to Russia right now. That seems to putting under the scope being further examined.
Victor Gao, why is Xi Jinping so friendly with Kim Jong-un of North Korea and Vladimir Putin of Russia? I mean, if he is this great, amazing world leader, as Trump has described him, surely he should be keeping a different kind of company.
Well, for the record, China and DPRK have the only blood treaty between China and any other country. That means after the end of the Korean War, China and DPRK have signed a mutual defense treaty whereby each side will need to come to the other side's defense if the other side is attacked. Now, this treaty is automatically renewable after 20 years, and it has never been terminated. That means between China and DPRK, we do have this time-honored mutual defense treaty. And China only has this defense treaty with DPRK, not with any other country. That means if any country wants to second-guess China's determination to come to DPRK's aid if DPRK is attacked militarily, then please read the national and the mutual defense treaty between China and DPRK. Now, between China and Russia, we engage in normal trade with each other. China will never allow any other country to disapprove or to disqualify China from engaging with any other country, including Russia, in normal trade relations, unless it is being blocked by the United Nations Security Council. That is the only litmus test. China does not allow any sanction imposed by any other country except the sanctions blessed by the United Nations Security Council.
I want to talk about nuclear weapons and nuclear testing a little bit, if I may. Donald Trump, actually to many people's surprise, also announced today on his way back to Washington that he wants to resume nuclear testing immediately after having not done so for 33 years. Now, what does Beijing make of that statement?
Well, Beijing's policy about nuclear weapons and use of nuclear weapons and non-use of nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon countries or nuclear weapon-free zones is well recorded. China will never use nuclear weapons against any other country ahead of time, and China will never allow any other country which uses nuclear weapon against China to survive China's nuclear retaliation. That means China has built up MAD capabilities to deter any country in the world which may be mad enough to strike China with nuclear weapons. China will never do this kind of thing against any other country, but China will never allow that nuclear power to strike China first to survive China's brutal, ruthless nuclear retaliation. I hope President Trump will get that message, and I hope the United States will never ponder the possibility of using nuclear weapon against China, because that will trigger immediate nuclear annihilation of the United States by the Chinese retaliation.
I mean, the Americans have not even dropped the slightest hint that they might want to target anyone with nuclear weapons, let alone China. So why are you so robust in your language?
No, it's not my language is robust. It is China's position is as robust as you can expect. China will not attack any country first with nuclear weapons, but China will never allow any nuclear power which strikes China first with nuclear weapon to survive China's nuclear retaliation, period. That's robustness you may be calling for.
And just briefly on this, do you think that China will now also resume testing of nuclear weapons?
China has never stopped nuclear testing. China's nuclear stockpile is a fraction of that of the United States or of Russia, but China's position is very clear. China will have enough nuclear warheads after the first nuclear strike by any nuclear power to make sure that that nuclear power which strikes China first will be annihilated by a nuclear weapon. That is Armageddon, period.
Well, beyond the mountain, I think, I'd just like to adding on this element in here. So while we're talking about the DPRK, while we're talking about China, and we also talk about Russia and Moscow earlier, I think one of the biggest worry Beijing would have right now at this moment is that a close ties between the DPRK and Russia does not serve China's interests very well. Now, having both surrounded by nuclear neighbors, and China's policy obviously is do not rule out, firstly, by not using the nuclear. However, I think these things need to be said that what Russia and DPRK has been doing is not something at Beijing's best interest at the moment.
Okay, let's move on to, I want to get back to the trade relationship between America and China, which is, at the heart of the meeting that we had today. And I just wonder, Victor Gao, whether you think at the end of the day, America and China can find some kind of mutual understanding where they both, produce high-end goods when it comes to, artificial intelligence. They both produce electric vehicles. They help each other on things like climate change. Or do you think that the competition between these two great powers is so intense that actually whatever anyone says, we are slowly moving towards some kind of confrontation?
No, I don't think so. I think by the end of the day, I truly believe in the inevitability of peace between China and the United States. I'm a complete opposer to the so-called destined for war scenario between China and the United States. Allow me to use soybean as an example. China has the biggest demand for soybean. And if the United States wants to wage a tariff war against China, then China will not buy a single item of soybean, to the great detriment of the soybean growers in the United States. That means the United States should give up any idea of weaponizing tariff against China, because otherwise China will retaliate. China will be ready to see complete winding down to zero of the two-way trading goods if the United States wants to weaponize tariff. That is the bottom line. China wants to engage with the United States. China wants to buy as much soybean as the American farmers can grow, and China is the only biggest market for soybean, amazingly.
Right.
Therefore, President Trump should really think about the well-being of the American farmers before he even thinks about the crazy idea of launching tariff war against China. We should go back to square one. That means China and the United States don't weaponize tariff against each other. That is the better way between China and the United States.
Right, but what about Chinese factories? You have a manufacturing bubble. You after your property bubble burst, you put all your assets and all your investment into manufacturing. You want to become, the world's, single most important manufacturing power, and you're brilliant at it. But you need to sell the stuff that you make, and you can't sell all of it to China or even to Southeast Asia or to Europe. You're going to have to sell a lot of it to America. So that is where the Americans have a stranglehold over you, don't they? Because if you don't sell the stuff, your factories go bust and your workers get very unhappy.
With due respect, I completely disagree with you, sir. Why? Because the United States has been calling for decoupling for at least 7 or 8 years. Do you think China will not prepare for that extreme situation, China's fully prepared if the United States really wants to decouple from China. Meaning there will be no more trade between China and the United States if that's what the United States wants to see. And China will be fully prepared. Do you know what we are talking about now? We are talking about landing persons on the moon ahead of any other country. We are talking about fusion technology to generate power without limit and bring the benefits to the 8 billion people in the world. We are talking about deep space, deep sea. We are talking about everything to be enabled by AI. We are not talking about producing toys or garments or textiles or shoes anymore. We are talking really about the cutting edge technology, the breakthrough that mankind can think about. That will be the stabilizing factor for the Chinese economic growth. I don't think there is any other country in the world which is so focused on what we call new qualitative productivity, which is a tongue twister, but which means you generate productivity through technological breakthroughs. That's what China is focused upon now.
All right,
Zhu Mark,
do you buy what Victor is selling?
Just for putting this, not the tongue twister, but the new terms on the economic terms that Beijing has defined, putting it aside, I think what we have seen so far, really, again, judging from the readouts we have from both ends today, is actually United States is promising to invest more in China. And that is actually not reducing the dependency, but actually increasing the dependency between China and United States. And if we're talking about market behavior, and what the United States has been asking China to purchasing extra soybeans, that is actually a market distortion. That is not actually something that follows the market economy. So whether China is willing to do that, that is up to Beijing to decide on the one hand. Then I think on the other hand, Beijing has already learned from the sense of unpredictability and also the economic behavior that's set up by the Trump administration. So what Beijing has decided is not to putting all the eggs in one basket. I think equally United States is playing on a similar strategy in here, to not overly dependent on China. And likewise, I think European Union does the same thing. So I think what we have right now is every single country, major economies in the world, they all become so inward looking. And it has led into the situation where we are today. So it's less of the dependency, but it's more about setting the fortress and how can I protect oneself.
Okay. Just finally, I want to spend a minute or two talking about Taiwan. First, you, Zhu. Taiwan, as far as I can gather, didn't come up at all in the meeting. And certainly there was nothing in the official readout about Taiwan. Does that surprise you?
No, it's not surprising me at all. I think really judging from the results and also judging from the mood with the United States, that obviously Taiwan is a major issue between the two. And then that's probably the fundamental agreement between the Beijing and the United States back to 1979 when they formally established diplomatic relations. So I think any major changes regarding Taiwan, firstly, that would require to have some at least foundational level of trust between Beijing and Washington. At the moment, I do not see that trust actually exist. And secondly, there are China hawks around the Trump administration and who deliberately looking for changes in status towards Taiwan. So I think really for Donald Trump himself, and he's not really willing to make a very bold move for that.
Victor Gao, final question to you. Do you think if your government were to encroach on Taiwan militarily, either through a naval blockade or an invasion, and we know that Xi Jinping is on the record for saying that he wants Taiwan to be reunified, as you put it, with the motherland at some stage before he leaves office, do you think that President Trump, should he be in the White House at the time, will sit by and do nothing, or will he intervene and use American power to stop you?
First of all, let's be honest. The real status of the relations across the two sides of the Taiwan Strait is the unfinished civil war back in 1949. So if China really moves to achieve unification or liberation of Taiwan, it is the resurrection of the unfinished civil war. Do you really think the United States or President Trump or anyone else in the White House want to be involved in a civil war between the two sides of the Taiwan Strait? That's number one. I'm completely ruling that option out on the table. Secondly, the status of Taiwan being part of China is carved in stone in the Cairo Declaration and the Potsdam Proclamation No one can change that. Whether you want to try that or not, that's another matter. But you can never change the final verdict of history in the Cairo Declaration and the Potsdam Proclamation. Meaning China is completely on the right side of history. If we want to have another civil war to finish the unfinished civil war back in 1949, that's China's internal matter. Taiwan will be liberated by peaceful means, preferably, or by a resurrected civil war, if it is necessary. We want
But they don't want to be
peace
liberated.
continue.
Victor Gao, they don't want to be liberated. They quite like living in their own country. The majority of Taiwanese do not want to be part of the People's Republic of China.
Well, the people in the Confederation did not want to join the Union, but President Lincoln decided otherwise. President Lincoln decided to bring them back to the Union with force if it is necessary. And this is exactly what the Union did against the Confederation. And that is the only logical conclusion for the relations between the Federation on the one side and the Confederation on the other side. The Confederation was defeated, and now they are very much part of the Union. And the United States, after the Civil War, has been one nation under God, indivisible. That is the truth for the United States. It will be the truth for China too. One day when China is reunited, you will see China will never be divisible, and no one can ever dare to split any part of China away from China.
Very quick one to you, Zhu, to finish the podcast. In how many years from now do you expect Beijing to make a move on Taiwan?
Well, I think we have the second centenary goal. So at some point, 2049, it will have to be resolved one way or another. Let me put in here.
That's quite a long time frame. I think Xi Jinping would probably like it to be done sooner rather than later. Thanks very much to both of you. Victor Gao, who stayed up late for us in Beijing. Thank you very much indeed.
Sanchez, and I want to catch you up now to this round of talks between Mr. Xi and Mr. Trump. The two leaders have basically agreed, and things go pretty much back to where they were before. In other words, and this is not the way it'll be characterized, obviously, by Western reporters, but the Chinese held their ground, and the U.S. negotiators, including Mr. Trump, pretty much caved on, as far as I can tell, almost everything. So let's go through it, because I think it's important here at JSpeak. What we do, we call this journalistically speaking. We try to be journalistically sound with our information. So these economic stories are sometimes hard to understand, hard to explain, and many of the people who explain them oftentimes are reporters or general assignment reporters, and they don't know much about economics or business because they don't come from that realm, which is why sometimes when you read their stories, things are very, very confusing. So let me try and make it as plain as I possibly can, because this is a negotiation. And one side, Mr. Trump, like people in a game of liar's poker, basically lied too big, right? It wasn't necessarily a lie. In this case, it was more of a threat. But if you've ever played liar's poker, basically, you know when somebody is lying because they say something and immediately everybody else who's playing against them calls them on it. It's like there's only 10 people playing liar's poker and the guy says he's got 30 aces and everybody says, call, right? Well, that's kind of what happened in this case. When Mr. Trump threw out an exaggerated number at the Chinese leader Xi Jinping, he may have been expecting that he would kowtow, that he would come down, that he would negotiate new terms. He didn't. So essentially, let me tell you how the call went. If we were playing liar's poker in this case, immediately what Xi Jinping said is, okay, you want to give us 400% tariffs, 500% tariffs? Fine. So here's what we're going to do. No soybeans for you, right? It's like a Seinfeld episode, right? No soybeans for you. In other words, China will stop buying soybeans from the United States. That is fucking huge. Any of you who've ever been to America or live in America or happen to be from the Midwest in America know that if you drive through any parts of the Midwest in the United States, mostly, but it's all over the United States, you see nothing but soybean fields everywhere. Soybeans are huge when it comes to the United States as far as an export, right? For farmers, this is very important. So as soon as the Chinese said that, Trump had a big problem on his hand. These are his voters. This is the MAGA base. This is the farm belt, right? And they immediately started complaining about this. So China said, we're not buying soybeans from you anymore. From now on, we're going to get them from South America. And that was one of the things that made Mr. Trump get on a plane and go make a meeting with Mr. Xi. But that's not the only thing. The other thing was they also told the United States that they're not going to sell any more rare earth minerals to the United States. In fact, they're closing down their supply of rare earth minerals. That's huge, obviously, because the United States can't afford that. Most of you know this, I know, but for those of you who don't, rare earth minerals are important because that's what's used to make the batteries for cell phones and for all EVs, electric cars, in anywhere in the world. This is a market which is the future. So obviously, the United States cannot afford to have the biggest supplier of the resource of rare earth minerals in the world shut them out. And that's essentially what she was doing. He was telling the United States, we're not going to buy your agricultural products or your biggest agricultural products and maybe more, which is soybeans, and we're not going to supply you with rare earth minerals. The United States is screwed if that were the case, right? So I'm not going to say that the United States went groveling to the negotiating table, but they certainly had to go to the negotiating table. So I'm trying to give you a basis of where this is and why this negotiation took place. And in almost a frenetic way, I would argue, right? The other one, and this is not going to get a lot of press, but the Chinese have always been on the side of Russia. Obviously, China and Russia are allies, as are China, Russia, and India now. So the Chinese have always been helping the Russians when it comes to the war with Ukraine. This, in the last 24 hours, just before these negotiations, they doubled down. The Chinese announced to the EU, Kalakaya, the dumb one, the so-called negotiator for the European Union. That woman's dumb. Anyway, they met with her and they told her that from now on, China will no longer be giving Ukraine 60% of its drones, right? Huge. And that's still on the table, by the way. So China has basically told Ukraine. Now, why did they meet with the EU? Good question. Because China doesn't send the drones directly to Ukraine. China sends its drone, really its drone technology, because they have to, most of this stuff is assembled. So China sends its drone technology through Poland and through the Baltic states. And from there, then they're redirected to Ukraine. So China has just announced, we're not sending that to those countries because we don't want them to send them to Ukraine. That's huge in many ways, not just so much to the United States. Trump, I think, cares, but not so much. It's the people who feed Trump and control Trump who care about that. But nonetheless, it was another item. So you see what's going on here? So Trump threatens China. China comes back and says, it's fine. You know what we have in China that you don't have in the United States? Time. The whole basis culturally for negotiating for China is about time. We will wait your ass out, and it doesn't matter. Of course, don't get me wrong. China needs the United States. China's economy is based on exporting goods because it's important to them, as well as receiving some goods from the United States. So it's not like China went into this with, we don't care, whatever happens, happens. No, 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 no. She was also getting pressure from within his country to come up with a deal here. So, but if I had to characterize this in terms of who needed the deal most, I mean, from all my readings and the analysis that I've done, I would say the United States is in a much more difficult situation. And even politically, she's going to be there for a long time. His approval ratings are around 80%, somewhere between 75 and 80. Trump's around 43%, and he's not going to be there because, he rents the leadership position. That's a huge difference. So why is it the United States seemingly caved, my word, and came rushing to the negotiating table? Let me let somebody else explain this to you. Here's Richard Wolff. Listen to how Richard Wolff characterizes the precarious situation, the poor health of the economy of the United States, and why the tariffs that Mr. Trump was putting on China or threatening to put on China, which he's now, by the way, gotten rid of, because all those things that I told you, Mr. Trump has basically caved on. Tariffs are down to from even 57 to 47%. In other words, they went down from their original number. The soybeans, China says, okay, we'll start buying some of your soybeans again. Interestingly, some of your soybeans. I think they've opened a market now in South America. And China has also said, okay, we're going to open up our markets again and let you buy some of our minerals and rare earth minerals so that you can use those as well. So again, before I take you to Richard Wolff, Professor Richard Wolff, what a smart, wonderful man. So the United States threatens China. China says, oh, okay, that's fine. But here's the deal. You're going to threaten us and increase our tariffs? We're going to do 1, 2, 3. We're going to do these things, right? To you. The United States says, oh, no. Okay, we'll come talk to you. The United States comes and talks. China says, okay, we'll get rid of those things that we were threatening to do to you or had done to you. So now we're back at zero, right? We're back at the baseline. In fact, if anything, China may have won if they got that extra 10% on the tariff points. Obviously, the market's recognizing this. Already the Asian markets are way up as a result of these announcements, where it looks like they've made a trade deal. Mr. Trump, of course, is doing all the talking about this, and the Xi government, as you might imagine, they're usually pretty reserved and pretty quiet, and they don't come out and thump their chests. But Trump is saying, oh, it's over. We got everything. Here's Richard Wolff explaining why the United States was in a situation where it had to kind of grovel, and what tariffs could potentially do to the U.S. economy. Once again, here's Professor Richard Wolff.
Look, we are having a bubble in our stock market. We have a stock market that's held up high by about 8 high-tech stocks. The rest of the economy is in all kinds of trouble. We are expelling millions of people who work very hard for very little. I mean, you add up our problems, the rest of the world looks upon the United States as a rogue country. No other country is heaving tariffs on everybody. We're the only one. People ought to stop and say, well, what's going on here? But we are making every other country pay tribute to sell into our country. That may make us feel like a tough guy, but you're giving an incentive to every company around the world not to do business in or with the United States. It's an extraordinarily desperate act.
Let me challenge you a little bit by just journalistically speaking, reading to you or sharing with you what Trump advisors would say to you if they heard your argument. They would say, yes, Professor, but what we're doing with these tariffs is We're trying to create conditions where we no longer do what you have just said, which is simply buy things from Vietnam and from China and from all of these other countries, while America makes nothing, which means our workers have nothing to do but sit at home. That's not a healthy environment either. So the Trump administration and his advisors have been saying to people like me, no, Rick, what we're trying to do is create jobs in America by revitalizing manufacturing and revitalizing production. And the only way we could do this is to increase tariffs on other countries so they don't feel like they can do all the manufacturing for us. I hope I explained that well.
Yes, you did. The problem is the argument is wrong.
Why?
No, and I'll give you several ways of understanding it. No company that is currently manufacturing something in Brazil or China or India or anywhere else is going to make the decision to spend a fortune, because it's very expensive, to move production back to the United States. That's an expensive decision. That takes years to actually do it all. You have to reorganize all your supply linkages, all your credit arrangement. It's an enormous act.
Okay.
And why would you not do it? Because the tariffs are a sometime thing. Mr. Trump himself can't agree on the tariff. He has a tariff high one day, low the next day. It's in effect. It's delayed for 6 months. It's delayed for 30 days. Any businessman or woman in their right mind would never make a decision to move to the United States when you have this herky-jerky, you don't know what's going to go on.
Yeah.
Number one. Number two, the rest of the world is not sitting there. They're going to put tariffs on us. And you know what that means? Lots of American companies that either already try to export or had hoped to export, they're going to be shut out of those markets, like India, for example. And that's going to hurt. Why would you come to America if the rest of the world might be saying no to exports from the America just as you move to America? No. That makes no sense at all.
There's something else I want to share with you, because I think this is an important conversation that feeds into this. It seems to me, I've covered China. I've spoken with Chinese officials on the business side, on the governmental side, which obviously in China, they're related, just like they are in the United States. In fact, I would argue that the business sector runs the United States more so than the business sector runs or is in charge in China. I would even argue that in many ways, China is much more of a democracy than the United States is. I think the leadership is more beholden to its people, evidenced by what's happened in that country in the last 20 years. The growth is phenomenal. And yeah, when you go there, you'll like I did, you'll talk to a taxi driver and they'll tell you, I can't stand the government, I can't stand Xi, blah, 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 just like you would everywhere else. Same as in Moscow, same as in New York City. But generally speaking, though they'll be critical of the government and they'll tell you so, they generally are happy with the direction. Obviously, you can't say the same thing for the United States, and most of the decisions in the United States are made at the behest of billionaires and big government. I mean, and big government ties with the business sector, which is why they get certain things like your money in many ways, and which is why they're taxed less than the average person. And we can go on and on, but I don't want to go in the wrong direction here. What I want to do is tell you how China stopped playing the nice guy game and why they stopped playing the nice guy game. China has always been okay with the United States and sometimes even its aggressive attitude. They've been okay with using the SWIFT banking system. They've been okay with using the dollar as the currency, the international currency, generally speaking. It wasn't until recently, and Mr. Trump has obviously accelerated this, when they made the realization that the United States wasn't just using its banking system and making the whole world use it, fine. Using the dollar as the international currency, fine. But what they were doing was weaponizing these things. Once they started weaponizing the dollar, weaponizing the international banking system, weaponizing these things, that's when, and most notably, I know because I was there covering it at the Shanghai Cooperative Organization Summit, right? That's the famous SCO you'll hear so much about, Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit. That's when the countries around the world all got together and said, okay, we've got to come up with something new. We've got to come up with an alternative just in case the United States continues down this path. And obviously, Mr. Trump and the United States have continued down this path. And this is something that the world and certainly we as Americans have to recognize that's now on the table. So here's a brilliant guy that I met in China. This guy is part of the Xi Jinping government. He helped set up the new government of China. Explains beautifully how it intermeshes with the business community. He's a Morgan Stanley guy. I mean, he's a private equity guy. This guy's worked on Wall Street, but he's Chinese businessman who is beholden to the Chinese government and is a big supporter of the Chinese government. So obviously he has a bias, but he's really good at explaining this. And I asked him these questions, and that's where the rubber meets the road for him and for China. The weaponization of the dollar and the weaponization of the tools that the world uses, which have been set up by the United States post-World War II. Here's my conversation with Victor Gao.
But I think the fact that SCO wants to set up this SCO development bank is a right step in the right direction. Why? Because once you have a development bank, if you want to do something related to the currency or the payment system or settlement system, it will be much easier. And this will pave the way to future more explorations and experiments about many other things involving the financial restructuring.
But explain that better to me. I don't understand. Because as I see it, a development bank is just a fund that would allow others to be able to tap into that fund so that they can develop their countries, their infrastructure, et cetera. Wouldn't you need to go further? Because with that development fund, they're still using the SWIFT banking system. They're still using the US dollar. How do you get from going beyond a development bank to something which is more significant?
First of all, purely from my perspective, using the dollar is not a problem. Using the SWIFT system is not a problem. The problem is that if the United States wants to weaponize the dollar, or if they want to weaponize the SWIFT system,
and they have,
that creates a problem. They did this against Russia. They may do this against China. They may do this against India. They may do this against Brazil. Holy cow, this is very dangerous. That means you, by taking this very risky step, destroying your own trustworthiness, destroy your own reliability. That forces other countries, your counterparties, to be creative, to really go to the edge of the envelope and try to come up with something alternative. So I would say, if SCO as a whole try to come up with something other than the dollar, it's not because they want to do that. It's because they were forced by Washington to do that. If they eventually come up with, let's say, a payment system, separate system outside of the SWIFT system, it's because someone weaponized the SWIFT system. That's one thing.
I've never heard it put that way. And I think that's so brilliant, the way you've just explained that. Because what you've just said to our audience, the millions of people who are going to be watching or are watching this conversation, and we're so glad that you're there, is there's nothing wrong with the SWIFT system. There's nothing wrong with the dollar. There's nothing wrong with what the United States and the West has put in place. It's only when you abuse it that it loses its credibility, and then it becomes to come into question.
Well said. Well said.
I'm a
Well
student.
said.
It's like you're my
No,
professor.
you're my teacher.
I want to go to your class. This is so fascinating. Okay, now let's follow the enthymime, if you will, the logical enthymime of what were to happen if enough of these countries here, and we're watching this happen. Mr. Putin mentioned it just the other day, come together and say, finally, we are going to do this. We're going to develop a currency. We are going to develop a banking system. We are going to develop a developmental system, which will challenge, if not maybe even compete and defeat the one that's presented by the West. What happens to the West?
Well, let me use the United States as an example. You know, ever since April the 2nd, which President Trump called a liberation day, I really do not know liberation from what. He launched the largest scale tariff war against the rest of the world. But he completely forgets one thing.
Yes.
That is, for the United States to have a dominant dollar and to have the United States suffering a trade deficit, this is both conditional to each other. If you want to have a dominant dollar, then by logic, you need to run into a trade deficit. Now, President Trump wants to reverse it. He wants to have manufacturing done inside the United States.
Yes.
They no longer need to buy all things produced abroad. That means the trade deficit will diminish eventually to be reversed into a surplus. But then the other side of the coin is more important. What about the dominance of the dollar? You need to give up the dominance of the dollar. So I think President Trump has not figured out what he really wants. He wants to have shoemaking manufacturing job back to the United States, toy making back to the United States, or he really wants, as I used to be educated and trained for in the Morgan Stanley style, always see the jugular, always see the prime of the prime. That is the financials, the investment banking, the private equity, and now the stability dollars, for example. So I think President Trump is contradicting himself. He really creates a situation where eventually the dollar dominance may decline and the manufacturing going back to the United States may or may not happen, and the United States will lose out on one front or on both fronts. That's the problem, I would say.
So there you have it. This is Jay Speak. Let me, so look, here's the score. Basically, the United States, China says, we told you we would take away our buying, our purchase of soybeans from you. And unless you reduce the tariffs, and the United States reduced the tariffs. We said we are not going to sell you any rare earth minerals until you reduce the tariffs. So the United States reduced the tariffs. We are continuing we have upped the ante in helping Russia, and we're now denying Ukraine drones. 60% of the drones in Ukraine were coming through, or the parts for the drones were coming through China. We've stopped that. And Mr. Trump has agreed with Mr. Xi that China and the United States will now work together to try to end the war in Ukraine. They will co-mediate. That's fascinating news, and it comes from that third point. Reading from my notes as I was preparing this on all the information that's coming out right now. And you're not going to hear a lot about that because the West doesn't know how to cover that story because they know nothing about the Russia relationship with China or the Ukraine war or the cultural or history behind that situation. So there you have it. I'm Rick Sanchez. Oh, by the way, I'm in Turkey, beautiful little seaside.
The image shows a Russian combine strike on targets in Kyiv region on the night of October 30th, dealing one of the largest blows to date. The map colors indicate the scale and complexity of the strike, involving Geran-2 kamikaze drones, Kinzhal ballistic missiles, and Kh-101 cruise missiles working simultaneously. A series of explosions indicate visually confirmed impact locations, showing no evidence of NATO anti-aircraft systems. Ukraine is not interested in a ceasefire. Now more than ever, Russia stands firm in its response to Zelensky's onslaught on Russian infrastructure. Open sources report, explosions were recorded in Borispol, They write that the drones flew very low and frequently disappeared from radar. It appears Russia is targeting Borispol International Airport again, and high-resolution satellite imagery from September 28, 2024, provides better guidance. However, after the attack, a major fire was detected in the largest hangar in the area of Ukraine's largest airport, as shown in images released by data NASA firms. Thus, the destruction of the hangars in Borispol, which served as a major gateway for military and civilian air traffic, further hampered Ukraine's supply lines, thereby weakening its capacity to sustain long-term military operations.
One year of combat. Russian forces are closing in on the city of Pokrovsk and may actually take it in the near term. I mean, we could be talking literal days from now after such a long time and so many starts and stops and so much heroic defense and so much effort put into by the Ukrainian armed forces. It now looks like Russia is on the cusp of taking this city. And even a bigger issue than taking this one city is the fact that the fundamentals that are allowing Russia to take this at this time also portend negative things for the rest of the front and therefore in the entire war. We could be getting closer to the end state of this whole war, no matter how much anybody in the West or in Kiev want to believe to the opposite. First of all, I just want to kind of take a snapshot of kind of what the daily front looks like. Now, we talk a lot about how this front is over 1,000 kilometers, and especially I've shown you that map a numerous times of the entire Eastern Front. You see it's this huge, long swath, lots of battles going on top of that. When people say that the Russian army is not that good and it doesn't have that much capacity, this is what you need to understand. This is a snapshot of a single 24-hour period on the front line. And this is reported by the Ukraine side. This is not claims by the Russian side. This is what is reported by the Ukrainian general staff. In 24 hours, the Russians launched a total in this one snapshot, 74 glide bombs in one day, 5,400 drone attacks of various types of the FPV drones, the first-person view drones, the so-called kamikaze drones, or the bombers that drop on there, 5,400 in a day. And that's how many that got to the target. We don't even know how many were intercepted along the way or knocked out with electronic warfare. That just shows you the incredible volume that are falling on top of the Ukrainian troops every day. And when you hear about these casualties they have, that's just two categories. That's just glide bombs and drone attacks. That doesn't include small arms fire, tank fire, artillery fire, or other rockets that are fired, etc. These multiple launch rocket systems, the MLRS so-called. That is an incredible amount of daily firepower. And it's concentrated at various points along the front, but spread out in certain degrees virtually everywhere. Nobody gets a rest from this. And you know, because I've told you many times, reported by General Syrskyi, the commander of the Ukrainian armed forces, multiple times this year, just within the last few months, how he keeps telling that they're not recruiting enough people, that they have a disparity of anywhere between a 3-to-1 disadvantage on the front lines. And as you're going to see in a second, Zelensky himself has said in the area of Pokrovsk, it's an 8-to-1 disadvantage on the Russian side. When you have those kinds of numbers and it's spread out over the entire war, you have a real problem. And let's take a look at some of these details here. Syrskyi has just actually visited. I think there's some of the images right there. He went to the front to kind of get a firsthand look. And what he has discovered is that they cannot, they're trying to send enough troops there to keep, and this is his words, the supply lines and the evacuation routes open. So he's obviously thinking we need to be able to get our troops out of there, and that's the right answer. I'm going to show you on the map exactly what he's trying to do and where he's trying to do it, and that makes sense. What doesn't make sense is that they're doing anything else, and it does appear that they're trying to keep the fight going on, that they're trying to send reinforcements down, not just to keep the evacuation routes open, but to continue fighting, and this makes no sense at all. And I'm going to show you a clip here. This is from yesterday, from Volodymyr Zelensky himself. He's talking to some of his generals and his staff. And listen, I'm not trying to be disrespectful to anybody here, especially when they're under life and death conditions in a war. But when you're watching this, this looks awfully similar to some of those movies that we've seen depicted of Hitler in the Reich bunker at the end of the war when he was completely detached from reality. Watch this.
Ситуація в Покровській, вона складна. Вона там, ну, дивіться, всі їх сили. Ви знаєте, що в цьому напрямку 170 тисяч зосередження ворога. Дуже багато. Прям дуже. І на ранок я розмовляв з главкомом, змін в Покровську немає. В Покровську є русські, наші їх знищують потрохи, да? Тому що, ну, треба берегти також особовий склад. Просто бігти там, а вони звідкись з цієї чи іншої будівлі, вони там ховаються.
So he's just saying, yeah, they're there, but we're destroying them bit by bit. Listen, folks, I've shown you the map for months now, especially, and more so as we've been getting up to this point. And I show you every time I've shown you the map, you've seen the Russian line advancing further and deeper into the city of Pokrovsk. So you're not destroying them piece by piece. Sersky also, in the report that was published this morning, said that in addition to keeping the routes open, he's also sending troops in there to destroy them one by one, just like the same thing that Zelensky just said there. But let's take a look at what that actually means on the ground. There was reported out this morning, I think it was this morning, I saw it this morning anyway, an interview that was released, a self-interview by a Ukrainian soldier inside of Pokrovsk, one of the guys who's been given that task. Watch what he says and what it looks like on the ground inside Pokrovsk.
Врешті ми у Покровську дуже довго добиралися з великими втратами. Частина людей в місті, частина 300. Ось що з групи залишилось, ще декілька людей наверху. Йшли допомагати хлопцям, звісно, Покровську. Але тепер допомога потрібна нам самим. По місту їбашать дрони, працює арта. Взагалі не зрозуміло, де хто, де наші, де вороги. А тепер ми ще й оточені. Нащо ми сюди йшли? Тяжко зрозуміти, що тепер робити теж.
Listen, they don't even know where their troops are. When you get into a situation like this, it is incredibly chaotic. And to be able to communicate where you are and then report that up to some headquarters who can then disseminate it down to other troops so that the Ukrainian troops themselves know where their friendly troops are and then where the enemy is. That's how operations are supposed to work. And it's always going to be complicated because you have issues like the electronic warfare that the Russians do, where it jams radio signals, etc. If you have radios. But this is such a difficult environment here because in order to have radios, you've got to have a continuous supply of batteries or some kind of power source. And if you don't have a power source, then you can't keep the batteries up. And then you're not even going to have any radios at all, whether they're being jammed or not. And that makes it incredibly difficult to be able to have spatial awareness to understand where it's called a common operating picture, where you understand where the troops are. So this guy is a perfect example of exactly how that happens. He didn't even know where his own people are. And you're telling him to go out and find out where these Russians are. One of the other reports out this morning in the Associated Press reported that some of the Russians are saying, the Ukrainians are saying that the Russians are really pressing the issue here. But they're also, it's not like they're having these so-called meat wave attacks where they're just sending in large numbers of infantrymen. As I've told you many times, Russia has learned that lesson, and that's the surest way to have mass casualties. So instead, what it says is they're sending nonstop, literally 24 hours a day, groups of 2 and 3 soldiers. So that means you have to spend an enormous amount of ordnance to try and get a small number of people if you can. They're dispersed, they're moving around. So it's hard to get them either with artillery, mortars, or drones. It makes it very difficult to do. And so then they hide real quick. And then there's another group that goes in over here, another one up here, etc. And that keeps the pressure on. And then you have to have these guys, if they have radios, to try and explain to their comrades where somebody is. But like this fella here, he may have no idea what's going on, because if you stick your head out at all, of course, as we've told you many times, you have the issue of artillery or mortar or drones falling on your head, dropping ordnance or flying into your window. So it makes it extremely life-threatening just to look outside, much less to say, now I'm going to go on a hunt and try to find where these guys are. There's just too many of them. And let me show you what that's looking like on the map. This is today's snapshot. Here's the Pokrovsk area. And you see, again, these darker or these brighter red areas are what's been taken in the last 12 hours. So yesterday I showed you that these areas up here had been taken. And now then some of these that were like in the gray zone have been turned into full red. And now they took another significant chunk into the, actually beyond the heart. This is the heart right here, the railroad area. They've now pushed even beyond into that. And, you know, let's just zoom in here so you can see what these look like. And when that kid we just showed you there, when he's talking about he's in a house, I mean, I'm just picking one at random here, but I mean, it could have been this one right here. And you can see that you're in this sea of what is red, and no one knows. There could be a Ukrainian here, one over here, another group small over here. They could be in the upper story of this building right here, but they don't know where anyone else is. The Russians also don't know. So they're sending these groups, and when they find somebody, they will certainly attack them, and they'll most likely vector artillery, a mortar fire, or a drone onto them. Most of these guys are going to be operating not as infantry to try to root people out, but as forward observers to bring fire onto it. Because what their intent, the Russians' intent, is to preserve their own manpower and expand and maximize the number of enemy casualties. And then they want to take as much territory, because you can understand, if you move far enough in there in force, then any of these troops, the Ukraine troops that are anywhere inside any of these red areas here, they know that they have no hope. All they can do is either try and escape and get back out, or surrender or die. I mean, those literally are your only chances. And the more you know, and you hear reports, either for radio if you have it, or from gunfire and bombs if you don't, that are beyond you and behind you, then you realize that you're cut off. And, you know, that whole group there, who knows if they even had any communication, and you can see that you know that all of this stuff is lost. You've held on to it for well over a year. And now then there's more areas. There's hardly any areas left that are under full Ukrainian control. And that's just in the city of Pokrovsk. Mirnograd, its sister city up here. The Russians are continuing to push in the north here. And then another, in the toehold on the outside of this area here, they continue to push in this gray zone in the southern part of Mirnograd. And then the whole area itself, there's also Ukraine troops that are defending down here. I think there's a battalion task force of some number, some strength down here, because they're defending all of these areas. That's what I think that you're talking about Syrskyi when he's saying, hey, we're going to have to keep this path open here. And this is the one, and I think this is the only one in the entire front line that I can see right now where the Ukraine side is having any offensive success at all. And they are doing everything they can to attack into this area here in Rodinska, because they're trying to push the Russians back here, because this is one of the areas that's keeping this gray area here, this darker area, under fire control. So that means that's what they're trying to keep open, the Ukrainian side is, so that they can get supplies in and out. And I hope they're trying to get their troops out and have an evacuation route. That's what they need to have. But that's why this is so crucial, because they don't have enough manpower to hold on to the areas here. Apparently they don't have any offensive forces to try and counterattack down here. So that's one of the reasons why the Russians are having so much more forward progress success here, because they're only going against whatever's in these buildings, like that fella I just showed you. So they're spending what left of their probably theater reserve on the entire front up in this area here, and they're having some success, but it's limited. And every time they try to take some areas, you have the Russians move up on top of this. But this is one snapshot. Let's don't get lost in this one battle. As important as it may be, especially for the Russians, because they're really looking to get another signature win. They really haven't had one since Avdiivka. They've had a number of territorial successes that are small, that names that people don't ever hear of, just some minor villages. And of course, they have been having success at dropping and killing large numbers of Ukrainian troops, which is their objective. So it's not splashy, it's not flashy, it doesn't have good headlines, which is what the West lives for. But the Russians are having this slow, methodical, but relentless and focused operation to destroy the Ukrainian armed forces. And clearly that is having success. So if they're losing this area right here, and there's this one in Kupiansk in the north, I'll get to in a minute, those are the areas where the Russians really are focusing, and the Ukraine side is really focusing on defending, because they want to keep that safe. But listen, they're not going to be able to do that. And let's run here to some places. I'm going to come back to that in just a second. But let me show you why what's happening on that snapshot in Pokrovsk is so important. It's kind of like the canary in the coal mine on the potential ability of the entire Ukrainian armed forces to continue fighting. First, let's go to an article in the BBC from 3 days ago, where the Ukraine Armed Forces manpower was exposed by Zelensky as being really in trouble theater-wide. Russian troops are making a concerted push in eastern Ukraine and have gained a foothold in the strategic hub of Pokrovsk, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said. Moscow's soldiers outnumber Kiev 8-1 in the area, and Ukraine cannot match that, Zelensky added, while insisting Russia has not yet achieved its result. Who cares if they have received it on that day? When you have an 8-1 disadvantage this stage of the war, when everybody in the world is focused on trying to get the manpower back up there and you haven't been able to succeed it, that should tell you something. That should tell you you cannot make this work out. Now, yesterday, the Atlantic Council published another report, which is even more damning. That was an 8-1 in Pokrovsk. This one here says that Russia's advantage on Pokrovsk exposes Ukraine's growing manpower crisis across the board. After 3.5 years of heroic and exceptionally bloody resistance, the fear is that Ukraine may now be approaching the point to where the country no longer has enough fighters to effectively defend the full length of the front lines in Europe's largest war since World War II. Based on the current trajectory of the war, this is vital, Russia's manpower advantage over Ukraine will only grow wider during the coming year. So you can see that it's not going to matter how heroic and how much vitriol you want to heap on the Russians, how much you want to say that they're awful and they're evil and all that, and how brave our side is fighting, and how we're going to keep on, we're not going to give up being the West, and we're going to keep giving you bullets and bombs and drones and all kinds of other ammunition. But you see now, as graphic as it can be, something I have been just screaming into this camera for so long. It's not about money or machines, as important as they are. It's about manpower. If you don't have the manpower, it doesn't matter how much ammunition you have. It doesn't matter if you have F-16 fighters. It doesn't matter if you have long-range missiles, ATACMS, or even if you've got the Tomahawk cruise missiles. None of that will matter if you don't have the troops to be able to hold on. I have told you many times, and now it's just being graphically depicted in such sharp relief, that even if you have a bunch of drones, even if you have 3 million drones that you can produce in a 12-month period, that's helpful. But a drone doesn't take or hold ground. You have to have men. And you see that now is crystal clear depicted as it can possibly be in Pokrovsk. Because even though Ukraine has a lot of ammunition, and they're also inflicting casualties on the Russian side, they don't have enough men by an 8-1 margin. So it doesn't matter how many drones they may have, because they don't have the troops that can defend. So they're continuing to lose ground. And this is happening all over the front. Let me just show you here. That was Pokrovsk we've displayed here. Let me show you what else is going on here. Let's first of all look a little bit south of here. This is another one of the things I've told you about before, and now I'm going to give you an update here. You may recall that this summer, the Ukraine side launched a counteroffensive and a counterattack, rather, and they took this whole swath here, all this area that's now in red was in the blue of the Ukraine side, because they pushed the Russians back quite a long way. But I told you, at the time, they didn't have the striking power and the sustainment ability to be able to do anything with that. And now it has graphically played out. The Russians over time retook every bit of the territory, and now then you see they actually went beyond that into the next. I think that this is Dnepropetrovsk area, but they went into another of the oblast there. And now then they've continued to push even deeper. In the last 12 hours, they've actually added this additional forward movement here in Novopavlivka. They're up in the direction of that. So now then that city is now about to come under threat. So that's in the south. Then we go past up Pokrovsk here, and we go to Konstantinivka. We've been mentioning this here. Russians are also on the move here. Again, this is just in the last 12 hours. They're continued to take some of the territory and the forest areas below, and now they are into the south part of the city itself, and they have continued to move up into that area. Then we go up into Seversk, which is one of the other areas that one of the recent ones where they've been going. This is something that Russians also been trying to get for quite a long time. And there's a number of Ukrainian troops that are defending in this area. The Russians are making more and more progress on the south part of the city. And then again here in the north part of that. So again, it looks like they're trying to do the same tactic that is working all across the front, bring wherever the Ukraine troops are in the defense into a pincer movement and cut off their routes of supply and get into fire control, all the routes that lead into it that keeps these guys supplied with food, ammunition, water, etc., and reinforcements, and keep that into fire control so that it makes it difficult, and then continue to move into this area behind it. And then just like what's going on in Pokrovsk, just like what happened in Bakhmut, just what happened in Avdiivka, just what happened in Kursk, they end up shutting the whole thing off and then destroying everybody inside of it, especially if they don't withdraw. Then the other biggest one here is and you see stuff is happening all along the front, but then the other big one that everybody's talking about is in the Kupiansk. And you see, again, more territory in the heart of the city has been taken by the Russian side. And that leaves fewer and fewer. And a lot of this is forested area. The actual city, you see, there's not that much of it left up here in the heart of Kupiansk, and it's not going to be long before that falls, or the Ukraine has to withdraw from that into the forest area. But you see, they got nowhere to go here. So almost the only place they can go is to try and get back up out of here, if they're allowed to do that. There's been so many cases to where the Ukrainian side has not even been allowed to withdraw. I mean, that's happened so many times. I've mentioned that in, I think, one of our last tactical updates here. But basically, the Ukraine command is just sending their men to death. I mean, you see that kid that Gary showed a second ago. I mean, he said, we don't even know what we're doing. All I know is that hundreds of my fellow soldiers have been killed and wounded, and some of us are still alive, but we don't even know what's going on. So why are we even here? He's rightfully asking. Listen, it is a mark of pride and admiration that the Ukraine men have fought so incredible and courageously in such bad conditions as they have been doing for the duration of this war. But don't just pat them on the back and say, what a great thing, you're so heroic, we admire you. That doesn't do any good to a dead man. That doesn't do any good to the children who will no longer have a father, or the women who will no longer have a husband, or parents who will no longer have their sons. Don't make yourself feel good by saying, great, what a super job you guys are doing, and send more of them to their death and say, yeah, give them some more bullets, give them some more artillery, whatever they need, just send it to them as they die pointlessly. Listen, look at the numbers that Zelensky himself has exposed, that Syrskyi himself has talked about. They don't have enough. The Atlantic Council, believe me, there's almost nobody that's more pro-war than these guys are, and they're definitely pro-Ukraine, and yet they're exposing it and being honest at this point and saying that the disparity will only grow. Why do you want to take someone who's that heroic and that brave and send more of them to unnecessary and permanent death? Yeah, and you're destroying Ukraine by patting them on the back. This is what the West is doing. I'd say euphemistically, the Western leaders, the White House, Whitehall, Champs-Élysées, all these folks, Berlin, You guys think you're doing a good job. You're doing a terrible thing. You are enabling Russia to completely destroy Ukraine and to wipe out their troops. That's their objective. That's why Russia continues to say, Sergei Lavrov has said, Vladimir Putin has said, we are willing to end this war today. If you'll take these ugly terms, and they're ugly, don't put lipstick on it. They're terrible. Denazification. So the government's going to have to change. Demilitarization, you're going to have to shrink down. There's not going to be any NATO. There's not going to be any security guarantees at all. But if you get rid of all those things, the war will stop and Russia will have reason to stop. There is motivation for Russia not to conquer any more of Ukraine. There is. So this myth that, oh, well, they just want to conquer all of it and then they want to go west is complete fiction. There's no truth to it whatsoever. And it's graphically depicted. There's reasons, specific reasons why, not just what they say, but the fact that their armed forces, what they have, is not enough to complete that task. And it doesn't take much common sense to see that they would never want to conquer Western Ukraine, because they know that that would be getting basically an insurgency guaranteed indefinitely. And nobody wants that in the Russian, and they don't need any of it. They want security on their borders. That's what they've said, and that's what an honest evaluation would show. So stop sending Ukraine men to their pointless deaths. Let's get this war over with and stop making yourselves feel better by sending more Ukrainian men to a pointless and unnecessary and certain death. Because listen to me, that saying there from the Atlantic Council, that is probably prophetic. If you don't do what I suggest, and if you keep doing what you've been doing, Herr Merz, Mr. Starmer, Macron, if you guys keep doing what you're doing, you will be signing the death warrant for Ukraine men and the country, because Russia will eventually, because you're not going to leave them any choice, as Alistair Crook said on our show just yesterday, the only choice left to Russia will be continued methodical military forces. And if they don't have enough to even continue on, and again, you saw that the one of the editors of the Times in London said he doesn't think that Kiev will be standing sometime this spring, this coming spring. So listen to what these people are saying, because by continuing on your path, the easy path, the one that doesn't take any hard decisions, you could cost the entire country. And then Russia, whether they want to or not, they may have to take the whole thing and then have to deal with it. I don't know. Maybe that's part of your plan. Maybe you want Russia to have to do that because you're okay with all of the Ukrainian armed forces being killed, and then, keeping a thorn in the Russia side after that. I don't know. I guess I can't dismiss that possibility that that's actually okay with you. You don't care about people dying, but damn, come on. Ukraine people, you guys ought to recognize that. Don't let your country be dismembered to serve the pleasures of a handful of leaders in the western part of Europe. That's horrible. That's awful. That's the truth, though, folks. That's what you need to know. Likely, Pokrovsky is going to fall possibly within days here, because you could have a collapse at this point. You've seen the status of the Ukraine forces in there, and then we'll see where it goes from there. But the disparity is only going to increase, and probably the cities are going to start falling in more rapid fashion. We'll see how that's going to work out. Listen, now let's go today. This is interesting here. This is a U.S. Marine wildfire operations in the Caribbean Sea near Venezuela, and this is just a real troublesome thing to me, because there's more combat power that's on the way into the Caribbean, and there is nothing that validates and justifies this use of military force. This claim, and you need to understand something. I know that the administration continues to say, oh, well, this is about drugs and this is about keeping our people safe. That's BS. Just strip that away. There's no truth to it at all. There's none. That's what they say because it sounds like plausible, and that's what they want. They want the American people to support it because they go, well, yeah, the drugs are a terrible thing. We have all these overdoses, and it's because of the drugs coming in. So let's go get them. As I've said, Venezuela is somewhere around 20th on the list. All these drug boats we've been blowing up, they don't even have the capacity to get to the United States. God only knows where these things are going, if they're drug boats at all, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest they're not. So it looks like we're just trying to paint this picture that makes people in America think that there's some threat that we're going to be stopping, and evidence refutes it resoundingly and strongly. There is not, and yet it looks like, and there was, I think it was Senator Scott. I can't remember exactly which one. One of the senators was on the television here just a few days ago and said, yeah, basically Maduro either walks away, sees all this combat power coming and just leaves. There's a coup, or he's going to be assassinated. But he's going to go one way or the other. That was astounding. An absolutely shocking statement by a sitting U.S. senator. We're not at war with Venezuela. They're not threatening war with us. There is no security threat at all from Venezuela. And yet here you're just categorically saying we're going to go kill the leader of an independent country in our own hemisphere, I guess because we don't like him. You can be more cynical and say because we want his oil, so we want to kill him and then install this other person here, this opposition figure that is very friendly to the United States and loves Donald Trump. And then I don't know. Then you think that we'll have full access to the oil on top of that, even though Maduro literally offered on a silver platter everything that we wanted because he does recognize the threat and the risk. But no, it seems like no, we just want to kill him. So it's a bad situation and it is troubling. We need to understand that this is a grotesque violation of the United States Constitution and a direct violation of the 1973 War Powers Act, which expressly forbids the President of the United States from using the military to go and attack another country when there has not been a congressional authorization, when there has not been a declaration of war, or we have not been attacked. Those are the only three possibilities in the 1973 War Powers Act. And I know Lindsey Graham has already been on TV talking about how it violated 130 times. So who cares if we violated 131? Understand the significance of that. His statement and these actions. We are not a country governed by the rule of law. It's black and white there for anyone to see who's willing to. And for those who say, well, yeah, but he's a bad guy. Maduro's a bad guy. They say he didn't legally win his election. So, and he does a lot of bad things. And he may even been responsible for killing people in his own country. So who cares if he dies? If you get into a world where you're comfortable with might makes right, that it's the rule of law of the jungle, not the rule of law, it's only a matter of time until the authorities get real comfortable just ignoring law as they see fit. And then one of these days, they're going to ignore some laws that you don't want to see violated, that take your rights away, that take your freedom away. And in a worst case scenario, take our lives away. That is where this can go. And when we get comfortable, I'm telling you, listen to me carefully. When we're comfortable that we just say, I don't care what our laws say, this is what we can do, so we're going to. That is a really dark and dangerous place. And I think more and more people need to stand up and say, no, no more. Whatever he may have done, if there's no congressional declaration of war, if there's no evidence that we can see and validate independently that something has happened that can cross these thresholds, then no, we're not going to support that. That's what we better do, because one day, folks, we could be on the receiving end of that. A government that shreds the rule of law and doesn't even pretend to follow it, they will not stop there. Don't think that just because it's in South America that somehow that there's a difference between domestic and international. There's not. The mentality that says the law doesn't apply to me, no laws will apply to them. Anytime they can get away with it and do it, they will do so to their benefit. That's just human nature. That's just how it works. So this is a dangerous time at home as well. It's something we need to pay a lot more attention to. And we will definitely keep it on your radar here, because we are unintimidated and uncompromising. We will tell you the truth no matter what it is, no matter where it is. Thank you very much, folks. We appreciate you, and we will look forward to seeing you on the next episode.
Indiscriminately when you were at war. That's why when we declare war, it's supposed to be done by Congress. It's supposed to be thoughtful. It's supposed to be debated. And we're not supposed to do it willy-nilly. And then when you have war, you just kill people in the war zone. And even then, there are rules of engagement.
Rand Paul is making a fatal mistake. He's telling you the truth about things that are important. And especially if you tell the truth about war, you're goner. Okay. So the corporate media is not going to tell you the truth about war. The Trump administration isn't going to tell you the truth about war. The Biden administration, Obama, Hillary, no one's going to tell you the truth about war. Rand Paul is, and he's making a mistake because let's remember Donald Trump is he's going to overthrow Venezuela. And the way they do it is they put sanctions on them. They try to wreck their economy. So people are, then they come in and they bring CIA money in and they give it to people and they go, overthrow the government. Here's some guns. Here's some weapons. Here's a lot of money. Overthrow the government. Then they install a puppet, and then the puppet turns over all their natural resources to the economic hitmen in the United States. And I know this is why Donald Trump is doing this with Venezuela, even though he's lying and saying it's about drugs, because that's a lie. Remember this? It says Trump says he's going to do land strikes. So he's not only is he bombing boats off of Venezuela, they're now going to start bombing inside Venezuela. Of course, they're going to bomb the land because that's where Venezuela keeps their oil. They don't keep it in the air. So and here, if you think I'm lying, here's Donald Trump when he was running for president telling you exactly why he cares about Venezuela.
How about we're buying oil from Venezuela? When I left, Venezuela was ready to collapse. We would have taken it over. We would have gotten all that oil. It would have been right next door.
And so that's what they're doing now. He tried it in his first administration. He tried to overthrow and install Juan Guaido, the puppet, and it didn't work because the people of Venezuela don't like Juan Guaido. In fact, they attack him every time he walks around in public in Venezuela. And now he's president again, and he's trying to do it again. And here's Rand Paul to tell you that they shouldn't be doing it. Here's Rand Paul. He exposes Trump's Venezuela false flag. Here it is.
Let's start somewhere where I think the two of you agree, and that's on some of the last bit of what Lucas was reporting on there about those strikes out in the sea. The president says there's going to be more information and briefing coming to Capitol Hill. Here's what he said Thursday.
The land is going to be next, and we may go to the Senate, we may go to the Congress and tell them about it, but I can't imagine they'd have any problem with it. I think they're going to probably like it, except for the radical left lunatics.
All right, so I'll start with you, Senator Paul. What do you need to hear?
So apparently Senator Rand Paul's a far left lunatic now because he's going to tell you the truth about war. So that's what they always do, right? So if you tell the truth about war, they have to discredit you, slander you, and say you're a wingnut and a conspiracy theorist. You're far left, you're far right. Here's a fastball down the middle Republican, Rand Paul, and here's what he says.
In a briefing, what questions do you have?
It's not so much about a briefing, but we haven't had a briefing. To be clear, we've got no information. I've been invited to no briefing. But a briefing is not enough to overcome the Constitution. The Constitution says that when you go to war, Congress has to vote on it. And during a war, then there's a lower rules for engagement. People do sometimes get killed without due process. But the drug war or the crime war has typically been something we do through law enforcement. And so far, they have alleged that these people are drug dealers. No one said their name. No one said what evidence. No one said whether they're armed. And we've had no evidence presented. So at this point, I would call them extrajudicial killings. And this is akin to what China does, to Iran does with drug dealers. They summarily execute people without presenting evidence to the public. So it's wrong.
Boy, that's one guy who'll never be president. Here he is again, proving you that he'll never be president. We don't blow up boats off Miami because 25% of the time, suspicion is wrong. Here he is to lay it down.
We have dangerous people in a lot of American cities, but we just don't go in and shoot them. I mean, we have trials, they get legal representation. And even on the high seas, it's been that way for generations.
So just in case you aren't up to speed on the story, Trump has been bombing fishing boats off of Venezuela and claiming he's fighting narco-terrorists. And he's letting us know that this is not how you fight narco-terrorists, unless you're China. This is not how we do it.
I bet China does a better job.
Yeah. And he's letting you know this is not constitutional. This is against everything we stand for as Americans. And there's a proper way to deal with. If you think someone's shipping narcotics, you're supposed to handle that. You're not supposed to just kill them without a trial. So he keeps going.
If you go off the coast of Miami, the Coast Guard will be stopping boats today, and about 25% of the boats that they stop, that they're suspicious of drugs, there won't be any drugs on board. So 25% of the time, the suspicion is wrong. And that's why we don't shoot and just blow up boats off of Miami, but neither should we be blowing them up off the coast of Venezuela. Number one, there is no fentanyl made in Venezuela. Not just a little bit, there's none being made in
No
Venezuela.
fentanyl.
These are outboard boats that, in order for them to get to Miami, would have to stop and refuel 20 times. They're in all likely going to Trinidad and Tobago, which is an island right off of the coast of Venezuela. So there's a lot of reasons to be worried about this. But number one is the broader principle of when can you kill people indiscriminately? When you're at war. That's why when we declare war, it's supposed to be done by Congress. It's supposed to be thoughtful. It's supposed to be debated. And we're not supposed to do it willy-nilly. And then when you have war, you just kill people in the war zone. And even then there are rules of engagement. But interdicting drugs has always been a criminal activity and a criminal anti-crime sort of activity where we don't just summarily execute people. We actually present evidence and convict them.
So he'll never be president telling the truth about war and what we're doing illegally, slaughtering people in fishing boats because we want to overthrow Venezuela and take their oil and they have lots of other stuff. They have minerals and things that we need. By the way, so this proves it that this isn't about getting rid of drug traffickers. So Ecuador rejects prosecution. And so the United States, Donald Trump ordered them to strike this vessel off the coast of Venezuela. They did. 2 people survived. So you would think the United States would then immediately sweep them up and prosecute them, put them in Guantanamo Bay and give them a trial because we know they're narco terrorists, right? Well, they didn't. They turned them over to Ecuador, and Ecuador says, we're not prosecuting these guys. What are you talking about? So they just let them go. So what does that tell you? That tells you that Donald Trump knows they're not narco terrorists and that they don't want to prosecute them and they don't want to have a trial because if they had a trial, it would come out that they were lying. Who's lying? Donald Trump and the administration.
Jimmy, when they catch a real cartel guy, they crow about it nonstop. And they make endless documentaries about how bad they got the bad man. We don't even know the names of any of these people they killed. So what does that tell you?
Prosecutors in Ecuador decided not to charge a man who survived the U.S. military attack in the Caribbean Sea last week and have already released him. There you go. Really? Those guys are such crazy narco terrorists threatening America that Donald Trump just releases them. Oh, we tried to kill him. We couldn't, but now we'll just let him go. Really?
Fair's fair.
So
Good game, guys.
Just to let you know, these are all the countries that we've overthrown in South America. You ready? In Central and South America. Cuba, Haiti, Dominican Republic, Grenada, Venezuela in 2002 and 2019, Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay, Argentina, Chile, Bolivia, Peru, Panama, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, and of course, Cuba and Haiti. Freedom and democracy. That's what that is. If you need a video about it, here's a video.
Here's every South American country which has had its government overthrown by the CIA since 1947. Costa Rica in 1948, Guatemala 1954, El Salvador 1979, Nicaragua 1981, Panama 1989, Paraguay 1954, Brazil 1964, Peru 1968, Chile 1973, Uruguay 1973, Argentina 1976, and Venezuela in 2002.
So Donald Trump, no matter who you vote for, you get John McCain. So there's some people who like Donald Trump who are cool with him doing the exact opposite thing that he said he was going to do when he ran for president, which was end the foreign wars, stop the regime change. Remember where Tulsi Gabbard in 2019 said Donald Trump is illegally violating the Constitution by trying to overthrow another sovereign country, meaning Venezuela. It's another regime change war, which is what Tulsi Gabbard was all about in 2019 when she was running for president. We need to stop our regime change wars.
Well, we don't win, by the way. I just want to point out, again, we're not going to win in Venezuela. We 100% are not going to win. We haven't won a war since the military-industrial complex was created.
Well, we've been able to overthrow people and
not a
install
win.
puppets. We have been able to do that. We haven't been able to overthrow Cuba, but we've tried millions of times. They tried to kill Fidel Castro like 135 times. Did you know that? And they failed every time.
Well, I'm talking about Trump's doing a war. He's going to send a land attacks. We're going to go to war, not skullduggery,
right?
Which I guess works a little bit. The thing where you use our troops and the best of the best to go in there and change. I've never seen it work ever.
I agree. We'll see what happens. I mean, they were able to get rid of Gaddafi and turn it into a failed state with open slave markets. They were able to get rid of Saddam Hussein and turn it into another failed state, which actually was the greatest gift we could give to Iran, because Iraq kept Iran in check. Now that's over.
It's not a win.
They were able to it's not. They were able to get rid of the Assad in Syria and install the head of Al Qaeda as the president of Syria. Is that a win for the United States?
Founding member of ISIS.
The founding member of ISIS, Syria, Al Qaeda, is now the president of Syria.
And two great groups.
And now Donald Trump is not only did he bomb Iran already in his presidency, not only did he bomb Yemen, he did that at the behest of Israel, both those places. Now he's bombing Venezuela.
Well, not all oligarchs are Jewish, Jimmy. There's other concerns in this world for oligarchs, He's got to give some attention to other people.
If you want to hear my jokes about this,
Kofi, follow me.